Anthony was a great person, man, kind-hearted, loved his kids, and he'll give you the shirt off his back. When we got the news, I got to like a corner, and I just balled up, man, and was just crying, because I couldn't believe it.
He spotted someone sort of pop out from behind the house, wearing all black.
Multiple gunshots ring out, followed by the sound of screeching tires.
He felt very disrespected, and so he wanted revenge.
He's been humiliated. You've got to retaliate.
He was so angry, so bent on getting one guy that he didn't care who else had to get hurt.
I found it pretty chilling. He showed absolutely no remorse.
The city of Rock Hill, South Carolina, sits just 20 miles south of Charlotte.
The Rock Hill community is grown up around the downtown area, and then, of course, neighborhoods keep building out of that. And so the neighborhoods closest to downtown are the oldest ones, and then things that begin to push out towards York and Charlotte and Fort Mill, some of the newer, more modern type neighborhoods. But overall, the whole community is very focused on sports, athletics, great school system, lots of parks and playgrounds, and generally a really great place to raise a family.
On August 9th, 2015, it's around 11 p.m. when multiple calls come into the Rock Hill Police Department's 911 dispatch center.
At this time, the neighbors heard 8 to 9 gunshots ringing out. No one knows what's going on. There's chaos on the scene.
Noise complaints are extremely frequent, especially in the Frank Street area. Hearing gunshots also is not infrequent, even if it's just something innocent like someone shooting in their backyard for fun. But in this case, the noise complaint coincided with gunshots. There happened to be other officers nearby who heard those as well.
And they heard multiple gunshots ring out, followed by the sound of screeching tires.
The officers who are already close by are able to get over to Frank Street pretty quickly.
There were quite a number of people around the victim who was in the front yard.
They find a man laying in the grass, face first, bleeding from his head with an apparent gunshot wound.
He was shot twice, once in his arm and once in the head.
It appeared he saw the shooter and threw up his arms to block the shot, but when he was shot in the head, he immediately went down.
They located a faint pulse on him. He was still alive at the scene at the time.
They roll him over to administer first aid, and they find the gun underneath him.
The gun was just lying between him and the ground. It was a handgun, so it was pretty clear that he had either been holding it or it had fallen out of his waistband where he fell. But they did just treat him right there until the medics arrived.
Since the .380 caliber gun was found underneath Anthony, police think that he was carrying it.
They didn't know exactly what had happened, but one, it's not unusual for people in that neighborhood to carry weapons for protection, and two, it could have easily been assumed that he and another person were possibly shooting at each other. They wouldn't have known that until they got the area cleared and were able to begin searching for spent shell casings. He also had his South Carolina identification in his pocket.
The man is identified as 30-year-old Anthony DeMond Hart.
The victim's still alive. They're trying to work him, trying to save him. He is transported to a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Many of the people who are out in the street know Anthony, and so word gets around pretty quickly.
They called me and it was like, man, Anthony just got shot. I was like, what? So, like I said, I got the keys, took off to the hospital. His friends was there and family was there. It was kind of a couple laughs at first, just joking about things in the past, but because we didn't know the severity of it.
Anthony Hart was born on August 12, 1984.
Anthony was born and raised in Rock Hill. He lived there his whole life.
He got a little brother. He kind of took him under his wing. You know how it is growing up with sisters and brothers. You yelling at them and fussing and fighting. You know, it's always yelling. Somebody yelling at somebody. Anthony act just like his father. His father is loud, just like Anthony was loud. His mother, she was laid back. We met in high school. If I could describe him with one word, it'd be loud. You knew Anthony was somewhere nearby and didn't even see him, but you heard him.
Anthony had a lot of friends. He played sports, and his mom's house was always filled. He had a lot of personality and a really big heart.
The list goes on with very kind, hard moments he did. And he'll give you the shirt off his back. Me and Anthony graduated in 2002. Anthony went straight into the work field. We both did, kind of started working right after high school. When it came down to it, to pay the bills, we were hard workers.
He became a father in his early 20s, and then he went on to have 2 more kids.
He has 2 boys and a little girl. He loved his children. He was a great family man. He was a great father.
Anthony eventually went to school to be an electrician. He thought that would be a good career and he would be able to support his kids. So when he wasn't with his kids or working, he liked to hang out with his friends in the neighborhood.
In our free time, we played cards. We loved to gamble. We might gamble on who walking in the door next. But it was mainly cards, dice, stuff like that, football games. We would gamble on anything.
He was a good guy who worked hard and kept a low profile. He loved his kids and would help anyone who needed it.
He was one of those guys that you just wouldn't expect to have no drama, you know, no beef.
On the night of August 9th, 2015, word that Anthony had been shot shocks his friends and family. They gather at a hospital in Charlotte, where they wait for an update.
Mama and Daddy, they were there because we didn't know, the situation at first. Everybody kind of was filling in what was going on, so I kind of got filled in when I got there.
Anthony was shot in his left temple and twice in his left forearm. Apparently, Anthony was trying to block the shots with his forearm, and Anthony then died not long after he arrived at the hospital. The shot to the temple proved fatal.
When we got the news that he had passed away, man, it was just like chaos everywhere. Everybody started screaming and crying. I remember me personally, I got to like a corner and I just balled up, man, and was just crying because I couldn't believe it. We just all just broke. It was terrifying.
Back in Rock Hill, homicide detectives arrive on Frank Street.
I do not know exactly if it was during transport or very shortly after. I remember that we had not been on the scene all that long before we were notified that he had died.
This seemed as a regular shooting call, but after he died, it took it to a whole different level. It was now a homicide case.
We located 7 shell casings that were of a .22 caliber. They were all near the back of the house, though. There were none near Anthony or his, where he fell. The shooting had happened from sort of the back side of the house towards the side of it, which would have given a direct line of sight to the roadway where he was located.
The casings looked like they were from some type of long gun or rifle. They all appeared to come from the same weapon.
But not from the .380 found underneath Anthony.
It was apparent that his weapon had not been fired. It was fully loaded. There were obviously no spent casings around him.
It was pretty clear that he was carrying a gun, probably for his own protection, but he never had a chance to fire it in his defense.
Police speak with the witnesses.
People had fled the area after the shooting happened for fear of their safety. But there were quite a number of people who had been inside the home there playing some cards that night, just hanging out, sort of having a kickback, as they call it. And they were all mostly outside looking at the situation.
One of them is a man named Roderick Wright.
Mr. Wright was just a longtime friend of the victim, Mr. Hart, and he was another one of the persons there that evening playing cards and hanging out.
Roderick tells investigators that Anthony had also been in the house.
So they were just generally hanging out that evening. I don't know how long they had been playing, but at some point he stepped outside, I guess, to get some fresh air.
Roderick went with him.
He was speaking with his friend Roderick Wright, and they were just catching up outside the home where there was a card game going on.
And as they were speaking, Roderick spotted someone sort of pop out from behind the back of the house, wearing all black.
It seemed weird, and it put both of them on edge.
He saw that person step back behind the house, and he said to Mr. Hart, let's go back inside. They began to walk back into the house out of concern for this man that he saw in the shadows.
So Anthony hesitated for a minute, and then he said, I got to get something out of my car.
Anthony went to his vehicle. We don't know for sure what he did, but our assumption is that he got his handgun out of the vehicle to protect himself and his friend as they were then going to go back inside the house where they would feel more safe. And then they were turning to go walk back inside.
Before they could get inside, the man reemerged.
This man stepped back out from the side of the house again and indiscriminately opened fire.
There was just gunshots, one after the other, just out of the blue.
Rock Hill, South Carolina police are investigating the shooting death of 30-year-old Anthony Hart. Investigators on the scene speak with Anthony's friend and witness to the shooting, Roderick Wright.
A man came from the side of the house, dressed in all black, just opened up fire, started shooting, and he said he panicked and fled the scene.
He was definitely on edge and scared and had gotten his car and sped away. So it was a very traumatic moment for him.
The witness stated that he fled from the scene in fear of getting shot himself. So as soon as he heard that the coast was clear, he came back.
Roderick's statement helps investigators develop a theory.
If someone is dressed in all black with a weapon, sneaking up behind the house, the theories would then be that they were there to intentionally rob or kill someone. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't like an argument that went sideways. And because there was a card game going on inside the house where money was being used in the betting, it was assumed that possibly the suspect was there to rob the people of their money at the card game.
Other witnesses who'd been at the card game report that one man left early and angry.
Sean Durham had been at the card game and lost his money and left angry and upset that he had lost the money. And it was assumed that he had come back to rob everyone to take back his money. That was the initial rumor that was circulating in the streets, and we heard that from many different people that night.
But Roderick can't say one way or another whether Sean was the shooter.
Roderick was only able to say that the suspect was wearing all black because the backside of those houses on Frank Street is very dark, especially that late at night. Very few of them have any back porch lights. And so it would have been pitch black, and Roderick would have been looking from a well-lit position in the street into darkness, and so he would not have been able to give any sort of a positive identification of the shooter.
They actually find Sean and talk to him. He admits that he left angry, but insists that he had nothing to do with the murder. He says that he went to a friend's house and stayed there the rest of the night.
Sean is still a suspect this time, but he could be lying about his alibi, so this time he's just a person of interest.
There's nothing connecting him to the shooting. No proof.
Detectives plan to follow up on Sean's alibi. In the meantime, more tips come in.
Investigators learned about a shooting that happened a week prior, and they said figuring out that this could be connected to the shooting.
On August 2nd, a man opened fire on a home on Frank Street, just 3 houses down from the scene of Anthony's shooting.
A male subject came in the evening, stood in the front yard, and opened fire into the house through the front windows of the house.
There were 9 people inside the home. Based on witness statements of individuals inside the home, it appears that one of the first or second rounds caused the blinds, the window dressings to fall. There were two small children, toddlers really, who were playing in the floor of the living room. He continued to fire multiple rounds into the house before fleeing the scene.
There were several people at home at the time, including a grandmother, a pregnant woman, and children.
Somehow, no one was killed.
The shooting was immediately reported by the family that lived there. The male subject inside had either been grazed by a bullet or by glass, and so he needed some medical treatment. The family was clearly traumatized by the shooting.
Investigators identified a suspect in the shooting.
One of the residents of that home, she did not know his name, but she knew him to go by Q.
The next day, by utilizing the nicknames that had been given to us, we were able to produce a photo lineup, go back to the family, and one of the young women was willing to cooperate with us and identify him as the shooter.
They learned that his real name is Quinteris Miller, and he was just 17 years old.
Based on her identification and the other evidence collected in the investigation, Miller was charged with those 9 counts of attempted murder and discharging a firearm into dwelling. Police were able to obtain warrants for his arrest on those charges, but he evaded police.
We knew that through tips that he had gone back to Chester and was in hiding. And so we contacted the City of Chester Police and the Chester County Sheriff's Department, let them know that he was wanted for an attempted murder, and they began doing surveillance and looking for him.
There's no clear connection between these two incidents, just rumors.
When we see these crimes happen in the neighborhoods, we know that there are witnesses, but oftentimes people don't want to speak up because of their distrust for law enforcement, for one, and that relationship has been strained. In addition to that, they're fearful of retaliation.
You have 2 shootings just a few houses away from each other within a week. Are they connected? The only way to find out is to find Quinteris and talk to him.
After 30-year-old Anthony Hart dies during a shooting in his Rock Hill neighborhood, police look to question the suspect in another shooting, Quinteris Miller.
He allegedly shot into a house full of people, which included a toddler and a senior citizen. There's a warrant for his arrest now, but now he's on the run.
Word on the street is that the 2 shootings are connected.
People are saying that the same person who shot up the house shot Anthony, but police don't know if that's true, and if that's true, what the connection might be.
As police continue to hunt for Quinteris, they take a closer look at the first shooting.
The family did tell us that it happened probably because of the fight that took place there in their front yard earlier that day. The family made the connection for us because they knew that Quinteris was present at both incidents.
On August 2nd, a man by the name of Swidarius Beatty got into an argument or a fight of some sort with his girlfriend at the time.
Beatty's girlfriend is Quinteris Miller's sister.
He received a call from his sister that she was there, and so he went over there to help protect his sister.
Quinteris Miller arrived on Frank Street with a group of other people to confront Mr. Beatty about the altercation with his sister. During that confrontation, things escalated.
A young woman got out some pepper spray, and she sprayed Quinteris' sister and everyone who was in her car. Quinteris got mad about that and hit the pepper spray out of the young woman's hand. Well, that was Beatty's sister. So Beatty got mad and attacked Quinteris with the brick.
Suddenly, Beatty hits him in the face with a brick and knocks him unconscious.
And then he began to, again, hit Quinteris more times while he was unconscious.
The The witness goes on to tell police that some good Samaritans jumped in to help.
There were two individuals about two houses down, a father and son, who were sitting on their porch and observing this go down in front of the houses on Frank Street. And after Mr. Miller had been knocked unconscious, Beatty was on top of him and continued to assault him. These two men got up and ran to help Mr. Miller, and they were able to effectively get Beatty off of him.
Anthony and his dad ran over and broke up the fight. And then Quinteris' sister and their friends were able to drag him into a car and get him out of there. No one was charged for anything that took place there because all the parties did not want to cooperate or press charges.
Rumor has it that Quinteris left the incident humiliated.
Beatty essentially got the best of Mr. Miller.
He felt very disrespected by the fact that he had been hit with the brick, and so he wanted revenge.
So at this point, Quinteris is embarrassed. He's been humiliated. Here you've come to help your sister, but you underestimated what you were walking into. So you expected to come in and save your sister, but instead, really someone had to save you. So now he's got to figure out what is he going to do to eliminate that, to make sure that he's not going to be made fun of, that people are not going to lose respect for him. Because oftentimes that's what it's about. It's about respect and whether someone's going to challenge you or not. You've got to come back and make sure that you reestablish and retaliate for what has happened to you.
Miller returns to Frank Street and he approaches the house there, and standing approximately 10 feet from the living room window, he opens fire with a pistol into the home.
Swaderis lived in that home with several family members, so it's suspected that Quinteris was just shooting into the home hoping to hit Swaderis. It's clear what happened there that day, but what does any of this have to do with Anthony Hart?
On August 13th, we got an anonymous tip.
The tipster says she overheard a disturbing conversation between Quinteris and two other men, Gabriel Mobley and Xavier Thompson, the night before Anthony's murder.
She heard the Miller and the others discussing what he had on his mind that night, that he needed a rifle to hit a lick, which is a term that essentially means that he wants to commit some sort of crime.
Gabriel says his brother has a rifle that he offers to Quinteris.
Gabriel Mobley retrieved the gun from inside the house and gave it to Mr. Miller.
The tipster says the men left the house immediately.
All three young men, Gabriel, Xavier, and Quinteris, left with the gun towards Frank Street.
Moments later, the tipster says she heard gunfire.
Witnesses say she heard gunshots. We know that this is the same day and time that Anthony was shot. And we know that three men headed in the same direction. And this is the same gun that killed Anthony.
Investigators are on the hunt for 17-year-old Quinteris Miller, a suspect in multiple crimes, including the murder of Anthony Hart.
A tipster tells police that Gabriel Mobley gave Quinteris a rifle that he may have used to kill Anthony, so they searched his home.
Because he was on probation, we had the right to search him and his house based on this tip that we got. And so we searched the house thoroughly, and we found a box of .22 caliber ammunition that had been intentionally hidden in the bathroom.
After searching the home, investigators found the bullets that matches the crime scene, but they don't find the gun that killed Anthony Hart.
He could not possess any ammunition at the time, so he was in trouble for that on the probation side of things.
They're getting closer, but there's still so many unanswered questions. Like, why would Quinteris kill Anthony? It just made no sense.
Then, on August 19th, investigators get the chance to ask him.
We knew that through tips that he had gone back to Chester and was in hiding. And so we contacted the City of Chester Police and the Chester County Sheriff's Department let them know that, he was wanted for an attempted murder, and they began doing surveillance and looking for him.
Quinteris was arrested in Chester, then transported to Rock Hill Police Department.
They spotted him getting into a car in downtown Chester. They just simply pulled him over, and he gave no problems. They arrested him and transported him up to Rock Hill for us.
At that point, Quinteris was arrested for attempted murder charges for shooting up the house.
Quinteris agrees to an interview.
He freely told us about the fight that happened in the morning, but then he denied having come back to shoot up Mr. Beatty's house that evening.
He denies involvement in any of the shootings.
Instead, he offers up an alibi.
He denied any involvement, but he did admit that he was in Rock Hill that day, that he was with the Mobleys, and he had claimed that he was playing video games with Gabriel Mobley at the time of the shooting.
And then once we got to the questioning of the murder, he requested a lawyer, and he ended the interview and did not discuss that at all. We informed the family of updates of the case as it was going along. So once we had arrested Quinteris for the first shooting, that's when we spoke to the family.
Anthony's dad is familiar with the house where Quinteris allegedly opened fire after the fight.
He and Anthony had friends who lived a couple of houses down from where the incident took place.
It was a very common place for them to be, and that's when he remembered.
He and his son, Anthony, they witnessed a fight on Frank Street.
Anthony's father put two and two together and let me know that he and Anthony had actually intervened in that fight. Because to him, he didn't know that it had anything to do with the murder, and so he didn't think to mention it because it's not uncommon to find teenagers, fighting in the streets. During the fight, Quinteris Miller was knocked unconscious, but the male subject who was assaulting him did not stop hitting him even though he was unconscious. So Anthony and his father intervened to prevent Mr. Miller from getting more injuries while he was unconscious on the ground, and they helped break up the fight.
This is it. This is the connection between the two shootings, but it doesn't make sense.
If Anthony tried to help Quinteris, why would Quinteris seek Anthony out and gun him down?
Meanwhile, a former suspect in Anthony's murder is also in custody on unrelated charges.
Sometime shortly after the murder, Sean Durham was arrested on a completely separate case.
Sean was considered a suspect early on because he got angry and stormed out of the card game when he lost money.
While he was in the York County Detention Center, he was not given a bond for his charges, and he desperately wanted a bond, and so he volunteered to work with the police to clear his name, because obviously he had heard the rumors that he was being named as the shooter in Anthony's case. And so he and his lawyer were cooperative with the police.
On August 24th, Sean and his attorney reach out to detectives.
Sean Durham, he volunteers to help police get Quinteris to confess.
He stated that if he was put in a room with Miller, he felt sure that he could get Miller to talk about it and to admit that he was the shooter in that case. They arranged to have both Miller and Mr. Durham transported from the jail to the law center in Rock Hill, which is where the Rock Hill Police Department is located. They placed a camera and some audio recording equipment in a room. They brought Mr. Miller and Durham into that room.
You just don't want to need Bill that.
On August 28th, 2015, police in Rock Hill, South Carolina, listen in as Sean Durham attempts to pull a murder confession out of Quinteris Miller.
Quinteris and Sean are placed in a room alone together with a hidden recording device.
The investigators then went to another room where they watched, I believe, a live feed from the camera as Durham spoke with Miller about the incident. And it was that conversation between Miller and Durham that really sealed Q Miller's fate. He asked him, were you just trying to get one under your belt, meaning a murder, taking a life? And Miller just shook his head and laughed.
It would have given Quinteris a lot of street cred. And so he seemed quite happy to talk about the murder with Sean. Sean was able to get Quinteris to open up and talk about the murder because Quinteris would have thought that his information would be safe with Sean. Quinteris looked up to and respected Sean. They ran in the same circles, had the same friends, had been through a lot together.
How many shell casings have they found?
And they said they found like 7, 8.
Sean really just approached Quinteris from a position of being sort of excited about hearing the details of the case.
Sean starts pushing. He starts getting at the question that police really want answered. Why? And what Quinteris says is a complete shock.
Wow. It wouldn't be wrong.
And he asked him, he said, you mean you killed the wrong person? And again, he laughed and nodded his head.
Then it wasn't even meant for him. That's crazy, man.
He then went on to talk about who the intended target was, that it was Mr. Beatty, and the reason why he was seeking retribution against him for being assaulted and getting knocked out a week before.
Quinteris admitted that he accidentally shot the wrong guy because he thought Anthony was the man who hit him, where in actuality it was Swandarius Beatty who hit him.
Quinteris thought he was returning back to the same house he'd previously shot up, where Swandarius lived.
He still had revenge on his mind, and so he essentially decided he wanted to go back and finish what he had started.
We're talking about a boy who's probably never done anything this serious before. He's walking through an extremely dark area. His eyes may not be adjusted correctly. He was actually several houses down. Quinteris essentially said that he just popped out. He started spraying, which means just shooting the weapon at the two people that he saw.
He mistakenly believed that one of those two men was Mr. Beatty.
This is waiting for my house.
He indiscriminately opened fire on these two individuals, striking, one of the bullets struck Mr. Hart in the head and killed him.
I don't want to got hit. Damn, bro, that's crazy, man.
Quinteris knew that he had not killed Beatty, but it didn't have much of an impact on him as to who he had actually killed.
You know where the time from? Come.
I found it pretty chilling, too, that he showed absolutely no remorse. To find out that you mistakenly killed an innocent man, someone you didn't even know, and to show no contrition or remorse, I thought was particularly chilling about Mr. Miller.
Even more chilling is the fact that Anthony attempted to help Quinteris.
The real tragic irony in this case is that the man that he mistakenly shot, Anthony Hart, was one of the two individuals who saved him a week before when he was being assaulted in front of the houses on Frank Street. Anthony Hart intervened for Miller.
Investigators finally have what they need.
Once we heard Quinteris give that information, it confirmed for us that this was all tied back to the August 2nd shooting at Beatty's home. This was just a 16-year-old who wanted revenge because he got hit in the fist with a brick. It really just made the whole thing that much more tragic.
With that confession, that was enough for officers then to charge Mr. Miller with the murder of Anthony Hart at that time. Under South Carolina law, he was an adult, so he was tried and prosecuted as an adult.
Following a taped confession, Quinteris Miller faces over 20 charges, including murder and multiple accounts of attempted murder. Investigators continue to work the case, interviewing his alleged accomplices in the murder, Xavier Thompson and Gabriel Mobley.
G. Mobley and Xavier Thompson went with Quinteris to commit the crime.
They put one another as the accomplice to Quinteris, and they tried to protect themselves. And so Xavier ultimately said, it was Gabriel and Quinteris who went to go do the shooting. Gabriel said, no, it was Xavier and Quinteris who went to do the shooting. So they were being somewhat cooperative, but it was hard to tell which one was telling the truth. It seemed a little bit more spur of the moment for Xavier and Gabriel to be involved in the case. It seemed like they were going along with their friend because it might have been an exciting thing. Maybe they didn't know exactly what he intended to do, although he did take a firearm to go do a lick. They weren't completely unaware.
They tell investigators that they dumped the gun in the woods.
They hid the gun somewhere. We never did find the murder weapon.
Prosecutors don't want to take any chances. They offer Quinteris the opportunity to plea.
Because we did not have direct physical evidence like fingerprints or DNA. There was no video of him committing it. That would still be a strong case, but not a guaranteed one.
For months, Quinteris and his attorneys refuse.
The case was a little bit more than a year old, and we had been unable to reach a plea agreement. The case was set for trial in the early part of 2017. It was actually not until just days before this trial was scheduled to start on a Monday morning that we received confirmation from Mr. Miller's attorney that he wanted to accept our offer to plead guilty. Miller wanted to plead guilty under the doctrine of North Carolina versus Alford, so he did not actually have to admit his guilt, but he acknowledged that there was substantial evidence against him, enough that there's a substantial likelihood that a jury would find him guilty. And with the evidence confirmed against him, he accepted the state's offer and pled guilty for the negotiated sentence of 30 years. He cannot be released early, he cannot make parole.
Quinteris does not make a statement or give any details of his crimes.
He was so angry, so bent on getting one guy that he didn't care who else had to get hurt along the way for him to get that revenge against just one person. So in his case, an entire family was traumatized. There were an elderly woman and a pregnant woman, children who their lives were put at risk when Quinteris shot up their home. Obviously, an innocent man, Anthony, lost his life over this, and ultimately, Quinteris never got the revenge he wanted.
Part of the tragedy is that he didn't just take Anthony Hart's life, he threw his own life away. And over something as just trivial as being knocked out in a fight. You know, I think that it's clear from his actions, mistakenly shooting the wrong person, that he's a very dangerous person. And his propensity for violence is obvious from the facts and the evidence in the case.
Anthony's killer was caught, and he is getting the consequences for what he did to Anthony. But I'm sure that his family would rather have Anthony alive today than, another young man in prison.
There's just something about Anthony Hart acting as a good Samaritan.
The human hands are a marvel of biological engineering, capable of the gentlest caresses and the most intricate, meticulous tasks. They can build a home, comfort a weeping child, or sign a letter of profound love. But those same hands, when warped by an insidious, slow-burning hatred, can also construct a vessel of absolute devastation. Imagine an elderly man sitting alone in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of sulfur, metallic dust, and stagnation. His fingers, trembling slightly not just from the onset of old age but from a manic, concentrated focus, are carefully arranging objects on a cluttered table. One by one, he drops heavy, sharp iron nails into a hollow casing. Each metallic clink resonates like a death knell in the quiet room. He pours in a volatile chemical mixture, measuring it out with the precision of a pharmacist, though his intent is entirely lethal. He seals the package, smoothing down the packing tape with a deliberate, slow stroke of his thumb, ensuring the address label is perfectly legible. He is preparing a gift for his own flesh and blood, a physical manifestation of a grudge that has festered for years, crossing the threshold from resentment into a cold, calculated desire for annihilation. Thousands of miles away, across vast stretches of rugged wilderness, towering mountain ranges, and deep, icy waters, a different scene unfolds under the soft, overcast skies of early autumn. It is a quiet morning, the kind where the world seems wrapped in a peaceful, slow-moving serenity. A husband and wife sit in their cozy home, enjoying the simple, predictable routines of a shared life. The smell of freshly brewed coffee fills the kitchen, and the only sound is the gentle rustle of the morning wind through the coastal trees. The mail carrier arrives, leaving a package on the porch, a seemingly mundane occurrence in the modern world, an everyday link to the outside community. The husband steps outside, retrieves the parcel, and brings it into the warmth of the living room. His hands, worn by time but steady, grip the edges of the box. His wife looks on, perhaps offering a casual remark about who the sender might be. There is no sense of dread, no sudden drop in atmospheric pressure to warn them of the impending horror. The husband begins to break the seal, his fingers working at the tape. In that split second, the thin line between an ordinary Tuesday morning and an absolute nightmare evaporates into a blinding flash of fire and screaming metal. When a bomb detonates, time does not merely move forward, it shatters. The sheer physics of the blast happen in milliseconds, but for those trapped within its radius, the moment stretches into an agonizing eternity. The initial flash is a blinding, brilliant white that sears itself onto the retinas, instantly swallowing the familiar colors of the living room walls, the family photographs, and the comfortable furniture. Then comes the pressure wave, a violent, invisible wall of compressed air that strikes the human body with the force of a speeding vehicle, tearing fabrics, shattering glass, and rupturing the delicate structures of the inner ear. The sound is not just a loud noise, it is a visceral, bone-rattling roar that vibrates through the chest cavity, deafening the victims before they can even process what has occurred. But the most insidious element of this specific device is the shrapnel. As the makeshift casing ruptures under the immense pressure of the expanding gases, the hundreds of iron nails packed tightly inside are transformed into a swarm of jagged, lethal projectiles. They tear through the air at supersonic speeds, ripping through wood, drywall, and human flesh with indiscriminate, horrific violence. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the quiet of the coastal home is replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the high-pitched ringing in the ears of the survivors and the crackle of localized fires. Smoke, thick and acrid with the smell of burned plastic, singed hair, and chemical residue, fills the room, turning the clear morning light into a murky, apocalyptic twilight. The husband is on the floor, the shock of the blast briefly numbing the catastrophic injuries to his hands and torso. Blood begins to pool on the carpet, a stark, terrifying crimson against the domestic backdrop. His wife, coughing through the dense smoke, her own skin stinging from the heat of the flash, scrambles toward him, her voice strained as she screams his name into the vacuum of her temporary deafness. The mundane reality of their life has been permanently dismantled, replaced by a chaotic scene of blood, smoke, and primal survival. They are ordinary citizens, elderly folk living a quiet retirement, completely detached from the world of international terrorism or organized crime. They are victims of an attack that feels entirely alien to their peaceful existence. As the emergency sirens begin their distant, wailing approach, cutting through the shock of the small coastal community, a profound mystery begins to take shape amidst the debris. Investigators who will soon arrive on the scene will find themselves looking at a puzzle that defies easy explanation. This was not a random act of vandalism or a tragic industrial accident, it was a targeted, deliberate act of attempted murder executed via the postal system. The use of a mail bomb requires a specific kind of malice, a detached, cowardly form of violence where the killer delivers death from a safe distance, never having to look into the eyes of their victim as the blow is struck. It requires planning, technical knowledge, and an unwavering commitment to causing harm. Who could harbor a hatred so deep, so consuming, that they would sit in a workshop, carefully packing nails around explosives, knowing the exact suffering it would cause? What sequence of events could drive someone to send such a weapon across the country to a quiet home on Vancouver Island? The answers, as they begin to emerge through the painstaking work of forensic investigators, will shock the nation not because of a grand geopolitical conspiracy, but because of how deeply intimate, how devastatingly personal the truth turns out to be. The trail of the package will lead detectives away from the ocean air of British Columbia, deep into the stark, subarctic expanses of the Yukon Territory, thousands of miles to the north. It will lead them to a modest apartment building designed for seniors, and ultimately, to a frail, 73-year-old man who shares the very same last name as the victim lying in the hospital. This is not a story of strangers clashing in the dark, but a tragedy of brotherhood curdled into absolute malice. It is an exploration of how a familial bond, meant to be a source of lifelong support and unconditional love, can decompose under the weight of financial ruin, unspoken grievances, and isolation until it transforms into something monstrous. The human mind has an incredible capacity to nurse a grudge, to feed it in the dark until it grows large enough to consume everything else. In the years leading up to that fateful September day, while the world moved on and ordinary lives were lived, an old man in the far north was letting his mind wander down a dark, obsessive path. He was reliving past slights, counting up perceived injustices, and blaming his brother for the ruin of his own life. Every day that passed did not heal the wound, it only allowed the venom to seep deeper into his psyche. The act of building the bomb was not a sudden, impulsive outburst of rage, it was a slow, meditative process of revenge, a project worked on over days or weeks, with each component carefully selected to maximize pain and terror. The tragedy of the Yukon mail bomb case lies not just in the physical devastation caused by the explosion, but in the horrific realization that the monster who sent it was the very person who had shared a childhood, a name, and a lifetime of memories with the victim. As we begin to peel back the layers of this extraordinary and disturbing case, we are forced to confront the darkest corners of human nature and familial dynamics. We will journey from the rain-swept forests of Port Alice to the icy, isolated landscape of Whitehorse, tracking a deadly delivery that shattered a family forever. We will examine the meticulous forensic investigation that reconstructed a bomb from scattered fragments, the psychological underpinnings of an elderly man driven to extreme violence, and the sudden, unsatisfying twist of fate that left the living victim without the closure of a courtroom verdict. This is a narrative of fire, blood, and a brotherhood broken beyond repair. This is the definitive account of the Yukon mail bomb case, a stark reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous enemies are the ones who know us best, and the deepest hatreds are those born from the ashes of love. To fully comprehend the gravity of the tragedy that unfolded in the autumn of 2018, one must first understand the starkly contrasting environments that framed this bizarre crime, places where geography itself seems to dictate the rhythm of human life. The story breathes through two distinct landscapes of the Canadian West, each possessing a unique, haunting beauty, yet thousands of miles apart. On one end of this deadly trajectory lies Port Alice, a highly isolated, picturesque village nestled on the rugged, rain-swept northwestern coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Built along the deep, dark waters of the Narutsos Inlet, Port Alice is a place defined by its relationship with nature, surrounded by dense, towering rainforests of Douglas fir and western red cedar, where the air is perpetually thick with the scent of salt water, damp earth, and pine. In 2018, it was a community of barely several hundred residents, a quiet haven where retirees and pulp mill workers sought a peaceful existence far removed from the frantic pace of modern urban life. In a town so small, life moves with a predictable, comforting slowness, neighbors know each other's faces, the arrival of the Daily Mail is a routine anchor to the outside world, and front doors are rarely locked, because violence is something that happens elsewhere. Broadcasted on television screens from distant cities, not on their own misty doorsteps. At the exact opposite end of this geographical axis lies Whitehorse, the remote capital of the Yukon Territory, located more than 2,000 kilometers to the north. If Port Alice is defined by the ocean and the dense canopy of the coastal rainforest, Whitehorse is shaped by the vast, subarctic wilderness, a place of extreme seasons, immense mountain ranges, and a frontier spirit that draws independent, often fiercely solitary souls. It is a city born from the chaos of the Klondike Gold Rush, where the Yukon River cuts through the valley under skies that burn with the aurora borealis in the winter and remain bright midnight blue through the summer. Yet, beneath the majestic landscapes of the Yukon lies a harsh reality of geographic isolation, where long, dark winters can stretch for months, confining people indoors and fostering a distinct kind of psychological pressure. It is an environment where individuals can easily slip into the shadows, living reclusive lives in small cabins or apartment complexes, their personal struggles obscured by the sheer scale of the wilderness around them. It was within this northern frontier, specifically within a modest senior housing complex in the downtown core of Whitehorse, that a toxic pool of resentment was quietly coming to a boil, entirely hidden from the peaceful coastal community on Vancouver Island. The connection between these two disparate worlds was forged not by commerce or tourism, but by the complex, fraying bonds of the Nepa family, a lineage that would ultimately become defined by a catastrophic act of violence. To understand how two brothers, born of the same blood and raised with shared histories, ended up on opposite sides of a lethal package, one must examine the slow, agonizing erosion of their relationship over decades. Roger Nepa, who had chosen the tranquil, temperate shores of Port Alice for his retirement alongside his devoted wife Shirley Bowick, represented a life that had found its steady, comfortable anchor. They had built a home that was a sanctuary, a place of warmth filled with the quiet joys of old age, domestic routines, and the gentle companionship of a long marriage. Roger was a man respected by those few who knew him in the village, a quiet figure who asked for little more than the peace that the misty island coastline provided. He had managed to navigate the trials of life to secure a modest, happy existence, a reality that stood in stark and painful contrast to the trajectory of his older brother, Leon Nepa. Leon Nepa, 73 years old by the time the autumn of 2018 arrived, was a man whose life had become increasingly defined by loss, isolation, and a deep, bitter sense of grievance. For many years, Leon had resided in Tagish, a tiny, remote community in the Yukon, located about an hour's drive south of Whitehorse, known for its pristine lakes and rugged lifestyle. Living in the Yukon requires a certain resilience, but it can also exacerbate a person's sense of solitude if they lack a strong social support system. Leon's world was fundamentally shattered in the year 2013, a pivotal moment that serves as the catalyst for the dark psychological downward spiral that followed. In that year, a devastating HOA hone ripped through his property in Tagish, reducing his home and most of his worldly possessions to nothing but ash and scorched earth. For an elderly man living on a limited income, such a disaster is not merely a financial setback, it is an existential erasure, a sudden stripping away of identity, security, and stability. Leon lacked the financial means, the insurance, or the physical capability to rebuild his life from the ruins of that fire, and it was in this state of acute vulnerability that his mind began to warp, looking for external targets to blame for his profound misfortune. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, a desperate Leon had publicly shared his intentions to leave the Yukon behind, speaking to local media about his plans to move down to Vancouver Island to seek refuge and live with his younger brother, Roger. This moment, filled with the raw necessity of an older brother turning to his sibling for survival, marks the intersection where familial obligation met personal resentment. While the exact, intimate details of what transpired between the two brothers during this period remain guarded by the family and the authorities, the psychological pattern is as old as humanity itself. The dynamics of an older sibling forced to become dependent on a younger, more successful sibling can create a toxic breeding ground for humiliation and envy. Whether Roger was unable to provide the extensive, long-term support that Leon expected, or whether the cohabitation exposed deep-seated, unresolved childhood rivalries, the arrangement fractured. Instead of finding a permanent sanctuary on Vancouver Island, Leon eventually returned to the Yukon, his pride wounded, his financial ruin absolute, and his mind heavily burdened with a growing, obsessive hatred for the brother he believed had failed him in his darkest hour. By 2018, Leon was living in a government-subsidized senior housing unit in downtown Whitehorse, a far cry from the independent life he had once known in the wilderness of Tagish. His health was failing, his world had shrunk to the dimensions of a small apartment, and isolation became a cruel magnifier for his grievances. In the quiet hours of the northern subarctic evenings, as the wind howled outside his window, Leon did not reflect on his own choices or the randomness of the fire that had ruined him. Instead, he focused entirely on Roger. In his mind, Roger became the architect of all his suffering, a scapegoat for his poverty, his loneliness, and his decaying health. This process of radicalization within one's own mind is a slow, methodical transformation, where a relative is stripped of their humanity and turned into a symbol of injustice that must be erased. Leon began to collect the materials necessary to execute a twisted form of retributive justice, utilizing the technical skills he had acquired over a lifetime in the rugged north to construct a weapon that would travel the vast distance between them. Carrying his venom straight into the heart of his brother's peaceful island sanctuary. To fully understand the tragedy of the Yukon mail bomb case, one must look closely at the man who was meant to die on that crisp September morning, examining the quiet, unassuming life of Roger Nepper. Roger was a man who had intentionally sought out the margins of the world, choosing the tiny, isolated village of Port Alice on Vancouver Island as the place to anchor his later years. In a society that often values noise, ambition, and constant movement, Roger was a gentle counterweight, a person who found profound contentment in the steady, predictable rhythms of a quiet retirement. He was a man of the Canadian West, comfortable with the damp, heavy air of the coastal rainforests, the smell of wood smoke, and the sight of the dark ocean inlets stretching out toward the Pacific. Together with his wife, Shirley Bowick, Roger had constructed a life that was intentional in its simplicity, a domestic fortress built on a foundation of mutual affection, shared history, and peace. Their home in Port Alice was not grand or ostentatious, but it was a sanctuary filled with the soft markers of a life well lived, well-worn furniture, family photographs capturing fleeting moments of joy, and the ordinary items that speak of a stable, harmonious routine. To his neighbors in the small, tight-knit community, Roger was a familiar, comforting presence, the kind of man who would offer a polite wave across a lawn, exchange casual pleasantries about the weather at the local grocery store, and live without causing a ripple of conflict in the town's social fabric. This peaceful existence, however, was not something that had simply fallen into Roger's lap. It was a hard-earned reward after a lifetime of labor and navigating the ordinary trials of existence, a stark reality that made the hidden malice directed toward him all the more tragic. 4 years, Roger had worked, contributed to his community, and maintained his relationships, surviving the economic shifts that often buffeted small industrial towns in British Columbia. His choice to settle in Port Alice, a village that had seen its population dwindle after the local pulp mill faced closures, spoke to his desire for a retirement free from the anxieties of the modern world. He and Shirley looked out for one another, their days marked by small, comforting rituals, the morning pot of coffee, the reading of the paper, the tending to their property, and the quiet evenings spent in each other's company as the coastal fog rolled in from the inlet. There was nothing in Roger's daily conduct, nothing in his interactions with the world, that could ever suggest he was a man marked for a violent, spectacular execution. He was, by all accounts, a thoroughly innocent victim, entirely disconnected from the dark currents of crime or vengeance that normally precede such a targeted and destructive attack. Yet, unbeknownst to Roger as he walked through his peaceful days, a dark shadow from his past was lengthening across the thousands of miles that separated him from the subarctic wilderness of the Yukon Territory. The tragedy of Roger's story lies in the fact that his very stability and success, modest though it was, became a source of intense, burning torment for his older brother, Leon. In the twisted internal narrative that Leon was constructing in his isolated Whitehorse apartment, Roger's quiet life in Port Alice was not a well-earned retirement, but an insult, a symbol of everything that Leon had lost and felt entitled to. When Leon's home in Tagish burned to the ground in 2013, stripping him of his independence and plunging him into poverty, he had turned to Roger, expecting his younger brother to absorb the catastrophic impact of his misfortune. While the exact details of the friction that occurred between them remain private, it is clear that Roger had to set boundaries, as any ordinary person would when faced with a deeply troubled, highly dependent relative. Roger could not fix his brother's ruined life, nor could he sacrifice his own hard-won peace to carry the immense weight of Leon's growing psychological instability. This boundary, which Roger likely established out of a basic need for self-preservation and domestic harmony, was interpreted by Leon as an ultimate betrayal, an unforgivable abandonment by a younger brother who should have submitted to his needs. As the years passed between the 2013 fire and the fateful morning of 2018, Roger continued to live his life in Port Alice, completely unaware of the depth of the venom that was fermenting in the north. He could not have known that every time he sat in his living room, every time he walked to his mailbox, his brother was imagining his destruction. Roger's innocence was absolute. He was living under the assumption that the ordinary rules of humanity and family still applied, that even in the wake of estrangement, a brother remains a brother, not a mortal threat. He had no reason to look over his shoulder, no reason to inspect his mail with suspicion, and no reason to believe that the blood running through his own veins was identical to the blood of a man who was actively plotting to tear him apart with shrapnel. This total vulnerability is what makes the portrait of Roger Nepper so profoundly heartbreaking. He was a man entirely at peace, wrapped in the warmth of his home and the love of his wife. Completely blind to the fact that a meticulously crafted instrument of death was already moving through the postal system, bearing his name and destinies to a horrific collision. The morning of September 11, 2018, began like any other autumn day in Port Alice, wrapped in the damp, cool embrace of the Pacific Northwest fog that regularly rolled off the Narutzos Inlet. Inside their comfortable home, Roger Nepper and his wife, Shirley Bowick, were settling into their familiar morning routine, entirely unaware that the invisible countdown to a catastrophic explosion had already reached its final, agonizing seconds. The air in the house was warm, smelling faintly of coffee and wood smoke, providing a stark contrast to the crisp, chilly air outside. When the Daily Mail arrived, it brought with it a package that appeared entirely ordinary, a modest, unassuming box wrapped in heavy packaging tape, bearing Roger's name and address in clear, steady lettering. There was no warning, no strange odor, and no ominous weight to suggest that this cardboard container was actually a highly volatile, meticulously constructed instrument of absolute destruction. Roger picked up the parcel, bringing it into the heart of his living room, a space dedicated to comfort, family memories, and peace, while Shirley stood nearby, watching with casual curiosity as her husband prepared to open the delivery. The physical act of opening a package is a mundane, almost subconscious movement, but as Roger's fingers worked to break the seal of the cardboard box, he unwittingly triggered a complex, lethal firing mechanism hidden inside. In a fraction of a millisecond, the chemical compounds packed tightly within the device reacted, transforming from a stable solid into a rapidly expanding wave of superheated gas that shattered the container from the inside out. The detonation was instantaneous, a blinding, brilliant flash of white-hot light that instantly consumed the room, searing itself into the couple's retinas and obliterating the soft morning shadows. Following the flash came the pressure wave, an invisible, crushing wall of compressed air that struck Roger with the force of a speeding vehicle, throwing his body backward and rupturing the delicate structures of his eardrums. The sound of the explosion was a deafening, visceral roar that rattled the very foundations of the house, shattering nearby windows and sending a shockwave through the quiet neighborhood that caused neighbors to stop in their tracks, paralyzed by a sudden, inexplicable dread. But the most monstrous aspect of the device was not the fire or the sound, it was the shrapnel that Leon Nepper had meticulously packed around the explosive core to maximize human suffering. As the pressure peaked, hundreds of heavy, sharp iron nails were transformed into a deadly swarm of supersonic projectiles, tearing through the air with indiscriminate, terrifying velocity. These jagged pieces of metal ripped through the living room, embedding themselves deeply into the drywall, the ceiling, and the furniture, but the vast majority of the blast's fury was directed squarely at Roger's upper body. The nails tore through his clothing and deep into his flesh, shredding the skin of his chest, arms, and torso, and puncturing his abdomen with horrific force. His hands, which had been holding the package just inches from his body, absorbed the absolute brunt of the primary explosion, leaving them catastrophically mutilated, with bones shattered and tissues completely destroyed by the intense heat and kinetic energy of the blast. In the immediate aftermath of the detonation, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ruined living room, broken only by the high-pitched, maddening ringing in the survivors' ears and the ominous crackle of localized fires ignited by the blast. Thick, acrid black smoke, smelling strongly of burned plastic, sulfur, and singed hair, filled the space, turning the bright morning into a murky, apocalyptic twilight that made it nearly impossible to breathe or see. Shirley Bowick, miraculously spared from the full force of the shrapnel but suffering from painful burns to her arms and hands, scrambled through the debris, coughing violently as she called out for her husband through the haze. She found Roger lying on the floor amidst the wreckage of their home, bleeding profusely from his catastrophic wounds, his body entering a state of severe, life-threatening shock. The ordinary peace of their retirement had been permanently shattered in a single, violent heartbeat, replaced by a chaotic scene of blood, smoke, and a desperate struggle for survival as the distant wail of emergency sirens finally began to pierce the morning air. The sirens of the first responding emergency vehicles sliced through the damp coastal air of Port Alice, their wails growing louder as they rushed toward the Nepa residence, changing the quiet village into an active crime scene. When the local paramedics and volunteer firefighters arrived, they were met with a scene that resembled a war zone rather than a domestic living room, the thick smell of chemical residue and copper-rich blood hanging heavy in the foggy morning. Paramedics immediately knelt in the debris to stabilize Roger Nepa, whose condition was critical, his mangled hands wrapped in sterile gauze while emergency personnel worked frantically to stem the severe bleeding from his abdomen before rushing him to the nearest medical chopper. As the ambulance sped away toward the helipad, a specialized unit of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, including forensic identification specialists and members of the Explosive Disposal Unit, took control of the house, cordoning off the entire property with bright yellow tape. The investigators moved into the smoking ruins with meticulous care, knowing that the scattered fragments of wood, plastic, and metal held the secrets to identifying a ruthless attacker who had used the federal postal system as a launchpad for murder. Forensic technicians dressed in protective white suits began the painstaking process of sifting through the wreckage, cataloging every single piece of evidence, no matter how small, under the dim, smoky light of the shattered living room. They used fine brushes and tweezers to collect dozens of heavy iron nails embedded deeply into the drywall and the ceiling, recognizing them instantly as a deliberate shrapnel mechanism designed to inflict maximum physical trauma on a human target. Amidst the charred remains of the cardboard packaging, detectives discovered blackened fragments of a unique plastic casing and tiny bits of charred wire, elements that clearly pointed to a sophisticated, handcrafted trigger assembly that had been rigged to detonate the moment the box was opened. Every fragment was placed into static-free evidence bags, documented with high-resolution photography, and prepared for immediate transport to the RCMP Forensic Laboratory, where chemical analysis would soon reveal the exact composition of the volatile explosive powder used in the device. The sheer brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the investigative team, who realized they were not dealing with a random act of mischief, but a cold, calculated assassination attempt that required technical skill, patience, and a deep, personal animosity toward the victim. While the forensic team combed through the physical debris, general duty officers began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors and interviewing the shaken residents of Port Alice to piece together the timeline of the package's arrival. Neighbors recalled hearing a sudden, bone-rattling boom that shook their own windows, followed by the terrifying sight of smoke billowing from the Nepa home, a sequence of events that shattered the town's historical sense of safety. Investigators focused heavily on the mail delivery route, interviewing the local postal worker who had handled the package that morning, trying to trace the parcel's journey through the mail stream. The critical break came when forensic specialists carefully reconstructed a portion of the package's shipping label from a charred piece of paper found near the blast epicenter, revealing faint but legible ink that tracked the origin of the delivery. The shipping data indicated that the deadly parcel had been processed and sent from Whitehorse, the capital city of the Yukon Territory, located thousands of kilometers north in the subarctic wilderness. This shocking geographic revelation immediately shifted the focus of the investigation, forcing detectives to look away from the quiet shores of Vancouver Island and dive into the distant, mysterious past of Roger Nepa to find out who in the far north harbored a hatred so intense it could span across provincial borders. With the discovery that the lethal package had originated thousands of kilometers away in the subarctic wilderness of Whitehorse, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police found themselves facing an incredibly complex, multi-jurisdictional investigation. A dedicated team of detectives from the Vancouver Island Integrated Major Crime Unit immediately linked up with their northern counterparts in the Yukon, establishing a secure communications pipeline to dissect the life, relationships, and history of Roger Nepper. In the initial, chaotic hours of a major crime investigation, the natural instinct of law enforcement is to cast a wide net, looking into every conceivable angle that could explain why a retired elderly citizen would be targeted with a military-grade device. Detectives spent sleepless nights poring over Roger's financial records, employment history, and personal associations, searching for any hidden dark corners, such as ancient gambling debts, association with organized crime syndicates, or unresolved business disputes from his younger years that could have suddenly resurfaced with deadly intent. Yet, the deeper the investigators dug into Roger's life in Port Alice, the more they hit a frustrating wall of absolute normalcy, as every interview with neighbors, former co-workers, and friends painted a picture of a thoroughly decent, peaceful man who lacked any criminal connections or wealthy enemies. As the financial and organized crime theories quickly collapsed into dead ends, investigators shifted their focus toward the mechanics of the bomb itself, hoping that the physical components would point them toward a specific type of builder. Forensic chemists at the RCMP lab in Vancouver were working around the clock, carefully washing the recovered iron nails, wire fragments, and chemical residues in specialized solvents to identify the explosive signature. They determined that the device was packed with a highly volatile, non-commercial explosive mixture, the kind of crude but deadly compound that required practical knowledge of chemistry and access to raw industrial materials. This led detectives to explore the possibility of a disgruntled former employee from the local pulp mill or a radical environmental extremist group targeting residents in the logging community, a hypothesis that briefly gained traction given the region's historical industrial tensions. Teams of officers interviewed local industrial suppliers, logging camp managers, and hardware store owners across northern Vancouver Island, looking for anyone who had recently purchased large quantities of specific chemicals or unusually large boxes of iron nails. However, this line of inquiry also yielded nothing but dead ends, as every lead petered out into legitimate commercial transactions, leaving the task force stranded with a horrific crime but no logical suspect in sight. The frustration within the command center was palpable as the 48-hour mark approached, a critical window in any attempted murder investigation where the trail can begin to go permanently cold. The break in the case did not come from a hidden criminal underworld or a corporate conspiracy, but from a painstaking, deeply sensitive review of the Nepper family tree conducted by a seasoned investigator who refused to ignore the geographical link to the Yukon. When detectives began asking Shirley Bowick and other extended family members about anyone they knew who currently resided in Whitehorse, a name finally surfaced that caused the hairs on the backs of the investigators' necks to stand up: Leon Nepper. Family members reluctantly revealed that Roger had an older brother, a reclusive 73-year-old man who had been living a solitary, bitter existence in the North for several decades. As detectives pulled up Leon's provincial files, the pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap into place, revealing a tragic history of a devastating house fire in Tagish in 2013 that had left Leon financially ruined, followed by a failed attempt to live with Roger on Vancouver Island. The realization that the primary suspect was not a shadowy international terrorist or a vengeful criminal associate, but the victim's own flesh and blood, shifted the entire nature of the investigation from a cold forensic puzzle into a deeply unsettling psychological drama of fraternal hatred. The identification of Leon Nepper as the prime suspect catalyzed a rapid, high-stakes coordination between the British Columbia and Yukon divisions of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, shifting the investigation into a phase of intense tactical planning. In the early morning hours of September 13, 2018, just 2 days after the catastrophic explosion in Port Alice, a specialized team of heavily armed tactical officers, plainclothes detectives, and an RCMP explosive disposal unit quietly assembled in downtown Whitehorse. Their target was a modest, government-subsidized senior housing complex where the 73-year-old Leon had been living a reclusive, bitter existence. Because they were dealing with a suspect who had demonstrated the capacity and willingness to manufacture and mail a highly lethal bomb, the tactical commanders had to assume that his small apartment could be booby-trapped or packed with unstable volatile chemicals. The surrounding streets were sealed off, nearby residents were quietly evacuated from their rooms without alerting the suspect, and emergency medical vehicles parked just out of sight, their engines idling in the crisp northern air as the assault team took their positions outside Leon's door. The breach of the apartment was executed with sudden, overwhelming force designed to disorient the elderly suspect before he could react or detonate any potential defensive devices. The heavy wooden door was shattered inward, and tactical officers flooded the small living space, their weapons raised as they shouted commands that echoed loudly through the concrete hallways of the building. Leon Nepper was caught completely by surprise, a frail, elderly man who offered no physical resistance as he was quickly secured in handcuffs and led out of the building under heavy guard. Once the suspect was safely in custody, the forensic and bomb disposal teams moved into the apartment with extreme caution, utilizing portable X-ray machines and chemical sniffers to clear the space room by room. What they discovered inside was a chilling, domestic workshop of death, a cluttered table covered in metallic dust, wiring tools, rolls of heavy packaging tape identical to that used on the Port Alice package, and a storage area containing a stash of the exact same heavy iron nails that had been extracted from Roger Nepper's body. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, providing a direct, unassailable link between the quiet apartment in Whitehorse and the bloody wreckage thousands of kilometers away on Vancouver Island. As Leon was transported to the local holding facility, team members in British Columbia were finally able to secure a clear legal framework for the prosecution, formally shifting the operation from an active manhunt to a criminal prosecution. Investigators began the grueling process of auditing Leon's recent movements, obtaining postal security footage from the Whitehorse mail terminal that captured the elderly man shipping a box of the exact weight and dimensions of the lethal parcel. The digital trail combined with the physical evidence recovered from his residence painted a definitive picture of a meticulous, long-planned act of attempted assassination born out of an obsessive family grudge. When news of the arrest filtered back to the medical team treating Roger Nepper, a profound sense of relief was instantly overshadowed by the devastating psychological trauma of the revelation. Roger, still fighting for his life in a hospital bed and facing the permanent amputation of his fingers, had to process the horrific reality that the monster who had torn his life apart was the very brother he had tried to help years before. A breakthrough that delivered justice in terms of safety but left the family's emotional landscape completely destroyed. Following the dramatic arrest of Leon Nepper in his Whitehorse apartment, the Canadian justice system moved swiftly to construct an airtight legal case against the 73-year-old suspect, aiming to bring a definitive resolution to an act of violence that had shocked the nation. Crown prosecutors working in tandem with major crime investigators meticulously organized the mountain of evidence gathered from both Vancouver Island and the Yukon, transforming forensic data into a narrative of cold, calculated malice. On September 21, 2018, formal criminal charges were dramatically upgraded in a provincial court, reflecting the sheer brutality and premeditated nature of the postal attack. Leon Nepper was officially hit with 4 severe indictments: attempted murder, aggravated assault, sending an explosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and unlawful possession of an explosive substance. Each charge carried the weight of a potential life sentence, and the legal team was fully prepared to present a devastating sequence of evidence, including postal surveillance footage, matching chemical compounds, and the identical iron nails found in both the victim's flesh and the suspect's workshop. A formal, public trial that would allow the scarred community and the surviving victims to see justice openly served was destined never to take place, as a sudden and irreversible medical crisis completely rewrote the ending of this tragic case. Just 2 days after his charges were upgraded, on the morning of September 23, 2018, correctional officers conducting routine checks at the Whitehorse Correctional Center discovered Leon Nepper in a state of acute medical distress within his segregation cell. The frail elderly man, whose physical health had been rapidly deteriorating under the immense stress of his arrest and the looming prospect of dying behind bars, was found unresponsive, his breathing shallow and his vital signs rapidly collapsing. Emergency medical technicians rushed to the jail facility, performing desperate resuscitation maneuvers on the floor of the cell block before transferring him to the intensive care unit at the Whitehorse General Hospital. Despite the best efforts of the attending physicians, Leon Nepper was pronounced dead later that afternoon, bringing an abrupt, jarring halt to the criminal proceedings before he could ever step foot inside a courtroom to face his brother's gaze or enter a formal plea of guilt. The sudden death of the sole suspect created a profound legal and emotional vacuum, forcing the British Columbia and Yukon judiciaries to immediately close the case file under a standard legal procedure known as an abatement by death. For the prosecutors and police officers who had worked sleepless nights to build an unassailable case, the suspect's death was a frustrating conclusion that left their meticulously prepared evidence forever unargued and untested before a jury. But the true weight of this sudden twist fell squarely on the shoulders of Roger Nepper and his wife Shirley, who were robbed of the ultimate validation that only a formal conviction and a judge's stinging sentence can provide. There would be no dramatic courtroom confrontation, no opportunity for the victim to read a powerful impact statement detailing the agony of his mutilated hands, and no definitive answer from the lips of the perpetrator explaining why a brother's love had curdled into absolute murder. The law had stepped aside because it had no power over the deceased, leaving the surviving family to navigate a complicated terrain of grief, anger, and unresolved trauma, realizing that while the physical threat was gone forever, the emotional closure they so desperately sought had died on a hospital gurney in Whitehorse. The smoke from the explosion in Port Alice has long since cleared, and the physical debris has been swept away, but the psychological crater left by the Yukon mail bomb case remains a permanent fixture in the landscape of Canadian true crime. This was an investigation that began with the terrifying physics of an explosive device and ended in the sterile, unyielding silence of a prison hospital room, leaving behind a profound narrative that defies the traditional boundaries of justice. In typical criminal cases, the cell door slams shut, the judge pronounces a sentence, and society feels a collective sense of closure, believing that order has been restored to a broken world. But when Leon Nepper took his final breath in the Whitehorse General Hospital, he carried the ultimate answers to his grave, leaving his surviving brother, Roger, to live out the remainder of his days with a body forever altered by shrapnel and a mind burdened by an unanswerable question. The legal system closed its files, stamped the paperwork as resolved, and moved on to the next tragedy, but for the victims, there is no neat conclusion, no dramatic courtroom vindication, and no moment where the pain suddenly transforms into understanding. This tragic saga forces us to look beyond the mechanics of forensic science and confront the deeply unsettling vulnerabilities within the human condition, particularly the fragile nature of familial bonds. We like to believe that blood relation is an absolute shield against malice, an ancient biological pact that guarantees safety and unconditional support even in the darkest of times. The reality exposed by this case is far more terrifying, that the closer we are to someone, the more intimately we understand their vulnerabilities, and the more devastatingly we can destroy them if that love happens to curdle into resentment. Leon Nepper did not build his bomb out of a sudden, impulsive flash of anger. He nurtured his grudge for 5 long years in the freezing isolation of the North, feeding it with memories of financial ruin and perceived abandonment until it became his sole purpose for living. It is a stark reminder that isolation can act as a radicalizing chamber for the human mind, turning a frail senior citizen into a calculated manufacturer of death who could calmly mail a bomb to his own brother without a shred of empathy or hesitation. As the quiet coastal village of Port Alice slowly reclaimed its peaceful routines, the legacy of the September 2018 bombing remained an indelible mark on the community's collective memory. A permanent loss of innocence for a town that once believed itself insulated from the horrors of the modern world. For Roger Nepper and Shirley Bowick, survival became a daily act of quiet defiance, a painful process of learning to navigate a world with physical scars and the heavy knowledge that the ultimate betrayal came from within their own family tree. Their story is not one of triumph, but of profound endurance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when forced to stand amidst the ruins of absolute malice. In the end, the Yukon mail bomb case leaves us with a haunting meditation on the nature of anger, the destructive power of isolation, and the realization that the deepest, most dangerous monsters are not shadowy figures lurking in the dark alleys of strange cities, but can sometimes be found in the familiar faces of those we once called family. The final chapter of this profound tragedy rests not in the official police archives or the legal definitions of a closed case file, but in the quiet, ongoing reality of the lives left behind in the wake of the explosion. When the dust settled and the media trucks eventually drifted away from the misty shores of Port Alice, a deep, resonant silence returned to the coastal community, but it was a silence heavily altered by the weight of what had transpired. For the people of Vancouver Island, the ordinary act of receiving mail, once an invisible thread of daily connection, was permanently recast as a moment of brief, subconscious hesitation. This subtle shift in the collective psyche of a small town is the invisible footprint of violence, a reminder that terror does not merely destroy physical structures, it subtly dismantles the unwritten social contracts of trust and safety that allow a community to thrive. The neighbors who once looked out at the Knepper home with casual familiarity now looked at it as a monument to a strange, subarctic malice that had breached their borders, a living testament to the fact that no geography is remote enough to insulate a life from the ghosts of its past. Within the walls of the reconstructed Knepper home, the process of healing was a slow, deliberate reconstruction of daily life that had to be carved out from under the shadow of a double betrayal. Roger Knepper's survival was a miracle of modern emergency medicine, but his daily existence became a grueling masterclass in physical and emotional adaptation, as his hands, permanently altered by the shrapnel, served as a constant, tactile reminder of his brother's final, desperate act of hatred. Every mundane task, buttoning a shirt, holding a cup of coffee, turning a door handle, required a conscious effort and a reclamation of independence from the trauma that had sought to render him helpless. Yet, alongside the physical pain was the deeper, silent labor of processing an estrangement that had ended in a flash of fire rather than a word of reconciliation. To live as the survivor of a fratricidal plot is to exist in a unique category of grief, where the person you mourn is also the monster you survived, and where the closure normally provided by a court of law was permanently denied by a sudden death in a northern prison cell. As time moves forward, the story of the Yukon mail bomb case transitions from a shocking headline into a sobering parable about the human condition and the dark pathways of unmonitored isolation. It stands as a cautionary narrative for a modern world where individuals can easily become untethered from community, retreating into private, digital, or psychological silos where grievances are allowed to ferment without the balancing perspective of human contact. Leon Knepper's descent into violence was a tragedy of isolation, a demonstration of how an elderly mind, stripped of its home, its independence, and its social anchors, can warp a lifetime of shared memories into a singular, weaponized obsession. In the final analysis, the case leaves us with a profound appreciation for the fragile, precious nature of peace, urging us to look more closely at the quiet fractures within our own lives and communities before they have the chance to harden into something irreversible. The true legacy of Roger and Shirley's survival is not found in the violence that sought to destroy them, but in their quiet refusal to let that malice define the remainder of their days, choosing instead to anchor themselves in the enduring warmth of their shared life. Far beyond the reach of the northern cold. The transformation of a public utility into a delivery mechanism for lethal violence represents one of the most profound violations of modern social trust. The Postal Service is built upon a quiet, foundational contract between the citizenry and the state, an unspoken agreement that a sealed package wrapped in brown paper and inscribed with a handwritten address will be treated with dignity, transported across vast borders, and delivered safely to its destination. For centuries, this network has served as the circulatory system of human relationships, carrying love letters, birthday gifts, family updates, and mundane items of commerce across the jagged geography of the continent. When a perpetrator subverts this system, they turn an entire nation's infrastructure into an unwitting accomplice to murder, utilizing the very hands of dedicated public servants to carry a hidden payload of fire and iron nails directly into an unsuspecting living room. The terror of the mail bomb lies precisely in this deceptive normalcy, as it exploits the universal human routine of checking the mailbox, transforming a moment of mild curiosity into an instantaneous flash of physical devastation. It is a deeply cowardly form of violence, one that allows the architect of destruction to remain thousands of miles away, insulated by distance and time, while an innocent mail carrier acts as the blind courier of their absolute malice. Investigators who analyze these types of crimes recognize that the choice of weapon reflects a specific psychological profile, one defined by an intense desire for control coupled with a profound lack of courage to face the target directly. The mail bomber does not want a confrontation, they want an execution that occurs in the private sanctuary of the victim's home, at a time of their own choosing, ensuring that the target is completely vulnerable and defenseless when the blow is struck. This detachment from the physical reality of the violence is magnified tenfold when the crime is set against the immense, brooding geography of the Canadian North, where isolation is not merely a physical state but a psychological condition that can warp the human mind over decades. The subarctic territory of the Yukon is a land of overwhelming scale, where massive mountain ranges, frozen rivers, and endless stretches of boreal forest dwarf the small outposts of human habitation. For many who choose to live on this frontier, the wilderness offers a beautiful, liberating escape from the constraints of crowded urban centers, a place where an individual can carve out an independent existence based on self-reliance and solitude. However, for an aging mind already burdened by failure, financial ruin, and a deep-seated sense of grievance, this profound isolation can transform into a dangerous crucible of obsession. Without the daily friction of ordinary social interactions, without the stabilizing influence of friends, neighbors, and community groups, a person's thoughts can easily turn inward, spiraling down a dark and repetitive path of resentment. The long, silent winter nights, where the sun barely rises above the horizon and the cold confines people to small, dark rooms for months on end, can act as a psychological pressure cooker, inflating minor slights into monumental injustices and turning a family dispute into a grand narrative of betrayal that requires a catastrophic response. In the case of Leon Nepper, the burning of his home in Tagish was not just the loss of physical property, but the destruction of his final anchor to reality, leaving him stranded in a world where he felt entirely powerless and forgotten. When he moved into the subsidized senior apartment in downtown Whitehorse, surrounded by other elderly individuals navigating the twilight of their lives, he did not find comfort in shared experiences. Instead, he withdrew into a state of absolute reclusiveness. The contrast between his cramped, institutional surroundings and the vast wilderness he had lost became a constant source of bitter torment, a physical manifestation of his perceived victimhood. In the quiet hours of his isolation, his mind fixed upon his younger brother Roger, living a comfortable, peaceful retirement on the lush, temperate coast of Vancouver Island, a reality that Leon viewed not with fraternal pride, but with a toxic, corrosive envy. He began to attribute every misfortune of his life to his brother's refusal to carry his burdens, constructing an elaborate, delusional framework where Roger was the author of his misery and therefore deserved to be utterly destroyed. The act of gathering chemical components, measuring out explosive powders, and packing heavy iron nails into a cardboard box became a twisted form of therapy for the lonely old man. A meticulous project that gave him a sense of purpose and power in a life that had otherwise slipped completely out of his control. The ripple effects of this fraternal hatred extended far beyond the immediate target, leaving an indelible mark of trauma on the systemic framework of the small communities involved and the public servants who inadvertently facilitated the crime. The postal worker who collected the package in Whitehorse, the truck drivers who transported it across frozen highways, and the local carrier who walked up the steps of the Port Alice home to leave it on the porch were all innocent participants in a sequence of deadly clockwork. In the aftermath of the explosion, these workers were forced to confront the terrifying reality that their ordinary, daily labor had been weaponized, that they had carried a hidden instrument of mutilation in their hands without ever realizing the danger. This realization creates a specific type of institutional trauma, a subtle but persistent anxiety that alters how public servants view their responsibilities and how a community interacts with its most basic services. A mailbox is no longer just a receptacle for letters, it becomes a potential source of hazard, a physical point of vulnerability that requires caution and suspicion. For a tight-knit village like Port Alice, where safety was once considered an inherent right of geography, the explosion was a violent wake-up call that proved no distance is great enough to protect a community from the reach of human malice. Forcing residents to re-evaluate their relationships with the outside world and look at every unexpected delivery with a newfound sense of dread. As the physical wounds inflicted upon Roger Nepper began the long, agonizing process of healing under the care of specialized medical teams, the psychological landscape of the surviving family remained a fractured terrain of unresolved grief and profound confusion. The human body possesses an incredible capacity to survive trauma, with skin grafting over deep burns and the nervous system adapting to the permanent loss of mangled fingers, but the mind has no equivalent medical procedure to repair the damage caused by a brother's betrayal. Every day, Roger was forced to confront the tangible consequences of his brother's hatred whenever he looked at his hands, a constant, physical reminder of a relationship that had ended in a flash of fire and screaming metal. The sudden death of Leon in his jail cell prior to a trial ensured that these physical reminders would never be accompanied by an explanation or an apology, leaving the survivors trapped in a state of permanent ambiguity. There was no moment where the truth was spoken in a court of law, no opportunity to look into the eyes of the perpetrator and demand accountability, and no definitive closing statement from a judge to signal that the narrative had reached its rightful conclusion. The case simply dissolved into the silence of the prison morgue, leaving a family to carry the immense weight of a crime that had no ending, a tragedy where the search for meaning is met only with the cold, unyielding reality of a grave. This absence of legal closure forces a deeper, more philosophical reflection on the limitations of human justice and the permanent nature of certain harms. We construct legal frameworks, courts, and correctional facilities to provide a structured response to chaos, believing that by weighing evidence and pronouncing sentences, we can somehow balance the moral scales of society. Yet, when a suspect dies before the law can execute its rituals, we are reminded that our systems of justice are fragile, earthbound constructs that can be easily derailed by the biological realities of aging and mortality. The true aftermath of the Yukon mail bomb case is found in this realization that some crimes are so deeply intimate and destructive that no courtroom verdict could ever truly repair the damage, and that the ultimate resolution must be found not in the public pronouncements of the state, but in the quiet, daily endurance of those who survived. As the years continue to pass, the story of the Knepper brothers serves as a haunting, permanent monument to the dangers of unexpressed resentment, a stark reminder that the invisible bonds of family can sometimes become the very chains that drag us into the deepest valleys of human tragedy, leaving nothing behind but the quiet rustle of the wind through the coastal trees and the enduring silence of an unresolved past. The physical evidence recovered from the cluttered senior housing apartment in downtown Whitehorse provided a grim, forensic map of an old man's descent into madness, offering a stark glimpse into the methodology of an unconventional killer. When the members of the RCMP Forensic Identification Suite unpacked their equipment in the small kitchen space, they did not find the sophisticated laboratory of a high-tech saboteur, but rather a pathetic and terrifying collection of everyday items repurposed for maximum human destruction. On the workbench sat a half-empty box of common household nails, their grey iron shafts identical to the jagged shards that the medical team on Vancouver Island was simultaneously extracting from the flesh of Roger Knepper. There were small, plastic storage containers containing traces of a grey chemical powder, a homemade explosive mixture that Leon had spent months experimenting with, testing its volatility and flame rate in the deep stillness of the subarctic nights. To the trained eyes of the bomb technicians, the workshop revealed a process of slow, deliberate trial and error, a project that had occupied the suspect's mind and body during the long hours of his isolation, giving him a false sense of control over a life that had become entirely unmoored from reality. Every tool, every roll of tape, and every scrap of wire was meticulously photographed, logged into the global case file, and packaged into plastic evidence bags, transforming the personal belongings of an elderly resident into Exhibit A for a future trial that would never come to pass. The contrast between the mechanical simplicity of the bomb and the catastrophic nature of its impact highlights the terrifying reality of modern homebrewed terrorism, where the instructions for death are easily accessible to anyone with enough time, patience, and malice. Leon did not require specialized military training or black market connections to build his weapon. He merely utilized the basic mechanical skills he had acquired over a lifetime of living in the rugged, resource-dependent economy of the Canadian North. In places like Tagish and Whitehorse, self-reliance often means knowing how to handle tools, how to manage volatile materials, and how to repair machinery without the aid of external professionals. This frontier knowledge, which is normally a source of pride and survival in a harsh climate, was completely inverted by Leon's obsessive hatred, turning a practical life skill into a highly effective tool for assassination. The simplicity of the design made it even more difficult for postal security screening to detect, allowing the package to pass through multiple regional sorting facilities and onto a commercial delivery truck without ever triggering an automated alarm. A vulnerability that sent chills through the federal security agencies responsible for maintaining the integrity of the nation's mail infrastructure. While the physical evidence was being processed in the laboratory, the social worker and medical staff who had interacted with Leon Knepper in the months leading up to his arrest began to provide detectives with a clearer picture of his deteriorating psychological state, revealing a man who was rapidly collapsing under the weight of his own bitterness. Neighbors in the senior housing complex recalled that Leon had become almost entirely nonverbal, refusing to engage in the casual conversations that usually occurred in the communal lounges or the laundry room. He had boarded up his windows with thick cardboard to block out the northern summer sun, creating a perpetual twilight inside his apartment that mirrored the darkening landscape of his own mind. When social services attempted to conduct routine wellness checks, he would speak only through a cracked door, his voice strained and his eyes filled with a suspicious, defensive glare that suggested he viewed the outside world as a collective conspiracy designed to ensure his poverty. He had become a ghost within his own community, a man who existed entirely within the confines of his grievances, waiting for the moment when his deadly project would be complete and he could finally strike back at the brother he believed had left him to rot in the shadows of the Yukon. The arrest of an elderly man in a quiet retirement facility also forced the local community of Whitehorse to confront the hidden realities of isolation and mental health decay among its aging population. A demographic that is often left vulnerable to the psychological pressures of the subarctic environment. In the wake of the police raid, local media and community advocacy groups began a painful dialogue about the lack of resources available to seniors who experience catastrophic life losses, such as the 2013 fire that stripped Leon of his home and his independence. When an older individual is suddenly disconnected from their support systems, their property, and their sense of purpose, the risk of severe psychological deterioration increases exponentially, often manifesting as extreme paranoia, depression, or deep-seated aggression. Leon's case was an extreme, horrific outlier, but it served as a wake-up call for health authorities, demonstrating that the long-term consequences of unresolved trauma can ripple outward in unpredictable and violent ways, turning a vulnerable senior citizen into a lethal threat to society. The tragedy was not just that a bomb had been sent, but that an entire system of community care had failed to recognize the warning signs of a man slowly drowning in his own resentment, allowing his mental decay to progress to the point of attempted murder. As the physical files of the investigation were being bound in heavy leather covers for archival storage, the legal teams in British Columbia and the Yukon were left to ponder the ultimate futility of their efforts. A realization that highlighted the limitations of the human justice system when confronted with the reality of mortality. The prosecutors had spent weeks building a pristine case, refining their arguments, and preparing their witness lists to ensure that Leon Knepper would spend the remainder of his natural life inside a federal penitentiary. They had envisioned a dramatic, public validation of the law, a moment where the state would step forward to protect the innocent and punish the guilty with absolute certainty. All of that legal machinery, all of that forensic brilliance, was instantly rendered meaningless by a sudden cardiac failure in a prison cell, proving that the ultimate verdict in human affairs is often delivered by biology rather than a judge's gavel. The case was marked as dead, the charges were erased from the active docket, and the lawyers returned to their offices to prepare for other trials, leaving the true narrative of the Yukon mail bomb case to exist outside the formal boundaries of the law, a story of unbroken silence, unpunished violence, and a family that was left to find its own version of survival in a world that had offered them no justice. The finality of an abruptly closed investigation leaves a peculiar, heavy silence that settles over everyone touched by its path, a stillness that is far from peaceful. In the corridors of the RCMP headquarters, the investigators who poured their lives into reconstructing the shattered remains of the parcel from Port Alice had to pack away their binders, label the evidence boxes, and slide them into the dark recesses of the archives. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that accompanies an incomplete victory. The threat has been neutralized, the suspect is no longer walking the earth, yet the psychological satisfying climax of a judge pronouncing a sentence or a jury returning a unanimous verdict of guilt is completely absent. For the forensic technicians who spent days peering through microscopes to match the tool marks on the cut wires and the microscopic composition of the explosive residue, their findings became merely historical footnotes rather than the pivotal courtroom revelations they were designed to be. The state had done its duty. It had mobilized its vast resources to solve a complex mystery across thousands of miles of wilderness, but it could not provide a final, therapeutic closure to a family that had been torn apart by a weapon forged from their own shared history. The absence of a formal trial also meant that the deeper, more nuanced truths about the relationship between Roger and Leon Knepper were never subjected to the rigorous cross-examination that brings hidden motives to light. In the absence of testimony, the community and the remaining family members were left to construct their own narratives, filling the void with assumptions, half-remembered conversations, and the lingering echoes of old family dinners from decades past. The tragedy became a myth within the region, a dark tale whispered in the local diners of Port Alice and the taverns of Whitehorse about the two brothers who allowed a lifetime of brotherhood to dissolve into an act of mechanical slaughter. This speculative aftermath can be almost as damaging as the crime itself, as extended family members are forced to look at one another with a subtle, unexpressed suspicion. Wondering if the seeds of Leon's madness exist within the shared bloodline or if there was something more that could have been done to prevent the catastrophic rupture. The unresolved nature of the case prevents the healing process from truly beginning, trapping the survivors in a perpetual loop of what ifs and unanswered questions that haunt the quiet moments of their lives. For Shirley Bowick, who stood just inches away from her husband when the world exploded into fire and flying iron, the physical recovery from her burns was merely the prelude to a much longer, internal battle against the onset of post-traumatic stress. The home that had once been a cozy coastal sanctuary, filled with the comforting sounds of the ocean wind and the rustling trees, had been transformed in an instant into a place of terror where every unexpected noise could trigger a rush of adrenaline and panic. The simple act of hearing the mail carrier's truck pull up to the curb or the sound of a heavy package being placed on the porch became a daily test of endurance, a psychological hurdle that required immense courage to overcome. She had to become the emotional anchor for Roger as he struggled with the permanent, painful physical limitations of his amputated fingers and the deep abdominal scars left by the shrapnel, all while fighting her own internal battles against the memories of the thick, acrid black smoke and her husband's screams. Their bond was forged anew in the fires of that explosion, transformed from the gentle companionship of retirement into a fierce, survivalist partnership dedicated to reclaiming a sense of normalcy from the wreckage of an old man's vengeance. Meanwhile, the senior housing complex in downtown Whitehorse slowly returned to its quiet, institutional routines, though the memory of the heavily armed tactical team breaching the building remained a frequent topic of conversation among the elderly residents. The small apartment where Leon had spent his final years, carefully packing explosives and iron nails into a cardboard box, was eventually cleared out, its walls repainted and its floors scrubbed to erase any trace of the dark workshop it had once contained. A new tenant would move in, an ordinary senior citizen looking for a peaceful place to spend their later years, entirely unaware of the toxic pool of resentment that had boiled within those four walls just months prior. This cycle of erasure is a necessary part of community survival, a practical way for a neighborhood to move past a historical horror, but it also highlights how easily the evidence of deep human suffering can be washed away by a fresh coat of paint and a change of tenancy. Leon's existence was reduced to a set of court documents and a death certificate, a pathetic ending for a man who had attempted to make a monumental, violent statement to the world through his crime, only to be completely forgotten by the very city he lived in. As the months turned into years following the 2018 bombing, the Yukon mail bomb case took its place among the most unusual and tragic anomalies in the history of Canadian jurisprudence, a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of human malice. It serves as a permanent case study for law enforcement agencies on the dangers of domestic radicalization and the complex logistics of investigating crimes that span across immense geographic distances. But more than that, it remains a cautionary tale about the absolute necessity of addressing mental health decay and isolation within vulnerable populations before those internal pressures manifest as external violence. The story of Roger and Leon Knepper is a tragic monument to a broken brotherhood, a narrative that began in the shared innocence of childhood and ended in a flash of fire on Vancouver Island and a lonely death in a subarctic prison cell. It leaves the world with a lingering, sobering thought, that the structures we build to protect ourselves, our homes, our laws, our families, are only as strong as the human hearts that inhabit them, and that when trust is completely replaced by hatred, the damage caused can never truly be repaired by the passage of time or the pronouncements of justice. The internal mechanics of a long-term grudge require a specific kind of intellectual fuel to maintain their potency over half a decade, a psychological process that remains one of the most terrifying aspects of the Yukon mail bomb case. In the ordinary course of human relations, time acts as a natural solvent for anger. The sharp edges of a disagreement slowly dull, memory fades, and the immediate emotional intensity of a betrayal is replaced by the pressing demands of the present day. For Leon Knepper, however, time did not heal the wounds of his 2013 financial collapse and subsequent displacement. Instead, it acted as a preservative, sealing his resentment in an airtight chamber of isolation where it could not be diluted by the outside world. Every morning that he woke up in his modest, subsidized apartment in Whitehorse, he chose to consciously reignite the furnace of his hatred, reviewing the details of his past grievances with the meticulous care of a historian. He allowed his mind to become completely dominated by a single, monolithic narrative of victimization, a mental state where his younger brother Roger was transformed from a flesh-and-blood sibling into an absolute symbol of his own life's ruin. This deliberate cultivation of malice is what elevated his actions from a tragic outburst of domestic frustration into a cold, calculated campaign of targeted assassination that required years of patient preparation. The physical construction of the mail bomb itself was a testament to this warped discipline, a project that demanded countless hours of steady, focused labor from an elderly man whose body was otherwise failing him. To mix explosive compounds safely in a small residential space requires a level of patience and emotional detachment that stands in stark contrast to the explosive rage that normally characterizes violent crimes. Leon had to carefully source each ingredient, traveling to different local outlets in Whitehorse to avoid raising suspicion, and then store them covertly within the tight confines of his senior housing unit. He sat beneath the dim light of his kitchen table, painstakingly measuring the chemical ratios, knowing that a single slip of his hand could result in his own immediate destruction before his vengeance could be delivered. The act of placing each individual iron nail into the cardboard packaging was a slow, meditative ritual of hatred, with every metallic clink representing a calculated deposit of pain intended for his brother's body. This level of premeditation demonstrates a profound cognitive split, where a man can maintain a superficial appearance of a frail, harmless retiree to his neighbors while internally operating as a highly focused, ruthless saboteur completely dedicated to the annihilation of his own family. The geography of Canada itself played an unwitting role in the psychological distance that allowed Leon to execute his plan without the interference of his conscience or his humanity. By sending his lethal creation across thousands of kilometers of rugged terrain, mountains, and ocean inlets, Leon effectively disconnected himself from the immediate visceral consequences of his actions. The postal system allowed him to pull a metaphorical trigger from a safe distance, insulated by the vastness of the Canadian landscape, never forcing him to witness the physical terror or hear the agonizing screams of his victims. He could drop the package into a mailbox, walk back to his apartment, and continue his quiet, reclusive routine, treating the impending explosion not as a horrific act of violence against a brother, but as a distant, abstract mathematical equation that would inevitably resolve itself in his favor. This spatial detachment is a common characteristic among mail bombers, who utilize the anonymity and reach of public infrastructure to achieve a level of cold, clinical separation from the blood and suffering they unleash, allowing them to maintain their internal delusions of righteousness right up to the moment the authorities breach their sanctuary. The legal closure of the case, necessitated by Leon's sudden death in his segregation cell, left a permanent void in the historical record, ensuring that the full extent of his planning and potential secondary targets would remain forever shrouded in mystery. Investigators were left with an array of unanswered questions regarding whether Leon had acted entirely alone, or if his years of isolation had led him to interact with radical online forums or specialized manuals to refine his bomb-making techniques. The forensic evidence clearly demonstrated his technical proficiency, but the lack of a trial meant that the digital forensics, his personal journals, and his medical history were never woven into a comprehensive public psychological profile that could help threat assessment teams identify similar individuals in the future. The suddenness of his cardiac failure effectively cheated the public of an educational opportunity to understand how elder radicalization occurs within isolated communities, leaving the case file as a collection of raw data rather than a completed narrative of justice. This lack of resolution is a frustrating reality for modern law enforcement, which relies heavily on the transparency of court proceedings to refine investigative methodologies and educate the public on the hidden dangers lurking within the margins of society. For the community of Port Alice, the legacy of the bombing slowly shifted from an active, public trauma into a quiet, historical marker that subtly defined the town's modern identity to those who knew its history. The initial terror that caused residents to look at their mailboxes with suspicion eventually gave way to a resilient determination to support Roger and Shirley, a collective effort that showcased the best of small-town solidarity in the face of absolute malice. Neighbors assisted with the physical repair of the damaged home, replacing shattered windows and reinforcing structures, while offering the quiet companionship that allowed the couple to slowly reclaim their space from the memory of the explosion. Yet, beneath this restoration lay a permanent understanding that safety is an illusion that requires constant vigilance, and that the modern world's complexities can reach into the most isolated sanctuaries on Earth. The story of the Yukon mail bomb case remains embedded in the timber of that coastal village, a narrative of a brotherhood that fractured so violently its shards flew across a continent, leaving a lasting testament to the destructive power of unyielded hatred and the enduring strength of those who survived its blast. The profound ripple effect of the Yukon mail bomb case extended far beyond the immediate victim and perpetrator, forcing a silent but significant reassessment of security protocol within Canada's national postal infrastructure. When a package carrying an improvised explosive device successfully navigates the chain of sorting hubs, provincial distribution networks, and commercial delivery vehicles, it exposes a critical vulnerability in the daily systems designed to keep the public safe. Security analysts and hazardous materials experts within Canada Post and federal intelligence agencies spent months analyzing how Leon Nepper's crude assembly managed to slip through transit lines without triggering physical or logistical alarms. The case highlighted a terrifying reality for modern border and domestic security, that small, handcrafted devices made from everyday industrial components do not possess the mass-manufactured footprint of military weaponry, making them exceptionally difficult to identify through standard automated screening processes. This chilling realization prompted subtle, behind-the-scenes updates to mail screening technology, package weight verification procedures, and employee training modules across the country, ensuring that the heavy price paid by Roger Nepper in his living room would at least serve as a catalyst for fortifying the safety of millions of citizens who rely on the federal mail system every single day. Within the realm of forensic science, the sheer physical isolation of the explosion's epicenter posed a unique logistical challenge that tested the adaptability of the RCMP's integrated major crime units. Conducting a high-stakes investigation where the crime scene is located on a remote coastal inlet of Vancouver Island while the primary suspect resides in the subarctic capital of the Yukon requires an immense expenditure of bureaucratic and operational energy. Detectives had to balance the immediate, time-sensitive need for physical evidence collection at the blast site with the equally urgent requirement to track digital and postal records moving across provincial lines before they could be systematically erased or overwritten. The absolute precision with which the forensic teams matched the chemical signatures of the homemade volatile powder and the manufacturing marks on the iron nails proved that geographic distance is no longer a shield for those who seek to commit cowardly acts of violence from afar. This case set a vital precedent for future multi-jurisdictional investigations in Western Canada, demonstrating that seamless communication, shared databases, and rapid tactical deployment can effectively bridge the gap between the most isolated communities on the continent, ensuring that the hand of the law remains long enough to reach those who hide in the deepest corners of the wilderness. As the physical environment of Port Alice continued its slow progression through the changing seasons, the deep internal fortitude displayed by Roger Nepper and his wife Shirley Bowick became an inspiration to the small, tight-knit community that had rallied around them in their darkest hour. Survival is not a singular event that concludes when the ambulance doors close. It is a grueling, daily labor of reconstruction that requires an individual to confront the limitations of a broken body and the persistent echoes of a traumatic memory. Roger's journey through multiple corrective surgeries, physical therapy sessions, and the emotional adaptation to his permanent amputations was marked by a quiet, dignified resilience that refused to grant his brother Leon a posthumous victory. By choosing to remain in their home, to rebuild the damaged living room, and to continue participating in the quiet life of the village, the couple effectively neutralized the destructive intent of the bomb, proving that a relationship built on genuine love and mutual support can withstand the most violent assaults of envy and malice. Their presence in the community served as a living monument to the power of human endurance, a quiet reminder that while hatred can shatter wood, glass, and flesh in a fraction of a second, it cannot permanently dismantle the foundational spirit of a life well lived. At the same time, the tragic, unexamined death of Leon Nepper inside the Whitehorse Correctional Center left an indelible stain of failure on the correctional and psychological support systems responsible for monitoring high-risk elderly inmates. When a suspect facing 4 severe felony charges, including attempted murder, dies in custody before his day in court, it raises profound questions about the adequacy of medical screenings and the management of extreme stress within institutional settings. Leon's rapid physical decline in the days following his arrest suggested that his body simply collapsed under the immense internal weight of his exposure. A sudden psychological deflation that occurred when his secret campaign of vengeance was dragged into the unforgiving light of public accountability. By dying in segregation, he effectively closed the door on any potential therapeutic intervention that might have led to a moment of genuine remorse, leaving the state to bury a man who was as much a prisoner of his own bitter obsessions as he was of the legal system. This unsatisfactory conclusion remains a sobering case study for correctional administrators, emphasizing the critical need for comprehensive mental health tracking among older offenders who present a unique combination of physical frailty and catastrophic violent potential. The ultimate legacy of the Yukon mail bomb case is captured in the heavy, contemplative silence that still lingers over the historical archives of the Canadian West, a narrative that remains permanently suspended between horror and unresolved justice. It stands as a dark masterpiece of domestic tragedy, a modern-day retelling of ancient familial rivalries where the weapon of choice was not a blade or a stone, but a meticulously engineered cardboard box sent through the modern machinery of the state. The story forces us to look past the dramatic headlines of international conflict and confront the terrifying capacity for violence that can simmer quietly within our own living rooms, fueled by nothing more than economic misfortune, personal isolation, and a refusal to forgive. As time continues to march forward, carrying the events of September 2018 deeper into the realm of history, the lesson of the Nepper brothers remains clear and unyielding, that the most vital infrastructure we must maintain is not the roads, the bridges, or the postal routes that connect our cities, but the invisible, emotional networks of empathy and communication that keep our families from dissolving into the destructive darkness of absolute hatred. The structural damage to the social fabric of a small community like Port Alice following an event of such unprecedented violence acts as a slow-moving toxin, altering the way individuals perceive their neighbors and their environment long after the physical evidence has been cleared away. In towns where the population is measured in the hundreds, safety is not a luxury provided by private security or high-tech surveillance systems, it is a communal currency generated by mutual trust, shared vulnerability, and the comforting knowledge that everyone's history is open for public inspection. When a meticulously crafted weapon of terror detonates in the heart of such a village, it doesn't just injure a specific target, it bankrupts that communal currency instantly, replacing a century of inherited peace with a sharp, pervasive paranoia. Every stranger walking down the main road is suddenly viewed through a lens of profound suspicion, every unfamiliar vehicle parked near the waterfront becomes a potential hazard, and the simple act of accepting a parcel from a courier becomes an exercise in calculated risk. This invisible transformation of the community's psychology is one of the most tragic, unpunished consequences of Leon Nepper's crime, a systemic dismantling of small-town innocence that no police investigation can truly restore and no legal statute can adequately address. The psychological profile of the male bomber, as studied through the lens of Leon's extreme isolation in Whitehorse, reveals a personality type that is fundamentally incapable of processing personal accountability, choosing instead to project their internal failures onto an external scapegoat until that projection becomes a lethal obsession. When Leon's life was reduced to ash during the 2013 fire in Tagish, his ego was faced with a catastrophic choice: either accept the harsh, random nature of misfortune and begin the agonizing process of rebuilding through his own labor, or construct a grand, comforting delusion where his ruin was the deliberate fault of someone else. By choosing the latter path, he effectively shielded his pride from the humiliation of poverty, transforming his younger brother Roger into a monstrous villain who owed him a debt that could only be paid in blood. This mental mechanism allows the perpetrator to view themselves not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a righteous executioner, a victim delivering a long-overdue sentence to a betrayer. The terrifying aspect of this delusion is its absolute impermeability to reason. Because Leon had completely severed his connections to the outside world, there was no alternative perspective, no voice of sanity to challenge his narrative, allowing his hatred to grow in a pristine, uncontaminated environment until it achieved the stability required to manifest as a physical bomb. The role of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in managing the immediate aftermath of the explosion also highlights the immense operational difficulties of preserving forensic integrity in a remote, rural setting where specialized resources are located hundreds of air miles away. When the local general duty officers first arrived at the smoke-filled Nepa home, they had to balance the instinctive, human urge to rush inside and provide aid with the strict protocol of securing an active, unstable blast zone that could contain secondary devices or volatile chemical pockets. The initial hours of the perimeter containment were critical, requiring a handful of rural constables to maintain absolute control over a chaotic scene while waiting for the specialized explosive disposal unit and forensic identification suites to fly in from major urban centers on the mainland. Every footstep taken through the debris by an untrained first responder had the potential to obliterate microscopic trace evidence, such as the unique tool marks on a severed wire or the faint residue of an accelerant that would ultimately prove vital in linking the device to Leon's workshop in the Yukon. The flawless execution of this initial containment phase stands as a testament to the discipline of rural law enforcement, demonstrating that even in the most isolated corners of the country, the foundational principles of forensic science can be maintained to ensure that justice remains possible, even when the suspect attempts to exploit the tyranny of distance to conceal his tracks. As the legal administrative machinery finally ground to a halt following the formal declaration of Leon's death, the broader family unit found themselves trapped in a unique, agonizing species of grief that had no societal blueprint for resolution. In a normal murder investigation, the family of the victim can unite in their collective hatred for the perpetrator, drawing strength from their shared desire to see a stranger punished to the full extent of the law. In the Yukon mail bomb case, however, the family was forced to mourn the horrific victimization of Roger while simultaneously confronting the reality that the architect of that suffering was their own patriarch, uncle, and brother. A realization that fractured their collective identity down the middle. To condemn Leon was to condemn a piece of their own history, a shared childhood, and a name that they all carried into the world, creating an internal conflict that silenced many family members and left them unable to seek comfort from the broader public. This internal division is a silent, ongoing tragedy that persists long after the court files have been closed, a heavy legacy of shame and confusion that passes down through generations, serving as a permanent reminder of how completely a single man's bitter obsession can poison the roots of his own family tree. The ultimate lesson of this extraordinary and dark chapter in Canadian history lies in the realization that our modern systems of connectivity, our highways, our digital networks, and our postal routes are deeply vulnerable to the ancient, primitive impulses of human malice. We spend billions of dollars fortifying our borders and monitoring international communication channels for threats, yet the most devastating dangers often originate from a simple, unmonitored room where an old man sits alone with his grievances and a box of ordinary iron nails. The Yukon mail bomb case reminds us that true security cannot be achieved merely through technological advancements or institutional surveillance. It requires a proactive, societal commitment to recognizing the warning signs of radical isolation and mental decay within our own communities before those internal pressures explode outward. As the memory of September 2018 continues to recede into the past, the story of Roger and Leon Nepa remains a haunting, permanent parable of the human condition. A stark reminder that the distance between a brother's embrace and a brother's murder can sometimes be measured by nothing more than a few thousand kilometers of wilderness and a heart that has forgotten how to forgive. The meticulous nature of the RCMP investigation revealed that the logistics of tracking a subarctic bomb maker required an unprecedented level of cooperation among regional postmasters, who became the unsung eyes and ears of the federal task force. In the immediate wake of the blast, as Roger Nepper lay in a medically induced coma on the mainland, detectives in Whitehorse were quietly auditing every single postal transaction that had occurred at the main counter on 4th Avenue during the first week of September. Postal employees, shaken by the realization that a lethal weapon had passed directly through their hands, spent hours reviewing security logs and descriptive receipts, attempting to recall the face of an elderly man who had presented a heavy, tape-bound parcel for shipment to Vancouver Island. When the digital footprint finally pointed to a cash transaction completed by a frail senior who matched Leon's description, the investigation moved from a theoretical search for a ghost to a tactical operation focused on a concrete physical target. This methodical retrieval of transactional data demonstrated that even in the modern digital age, old-fashioned police work combined with the sharp institutional memory of community workers remains the most effective barrier against those who utilize the public infrastructure to commit horrific acts of violence. The sheer physical layout of the Whitehorse Correctional Center, where Leon Nepper spent the final 48 hours of his life, added a grim, stark layer of isolation to an existence that was already deeply defined by solitude. Placed in a specialized medical segregation cell due to his advanced age and volatile mental state, Leon was cut off from the general population, surrounded only by the sterile concrete walls, the constant, institutional hum of fluorescent lighting, and the watchful eyes of guards peering through a thick plexiglass window. This confinement was a radical and jarring shift from the absolute freedom of the northern wilderness he had once inhabited in Tagish, representing a sudden, total loss of control that his fragile psyche could not withstand. The walls of his cell did not contain the tools, the chemicals, or the iron nails that had given him a false sense of omnipotence for 5 years. Instead, they reflected only the reality of his criminal exposure and the looming certainty of a public trial that would strip away his self-constructed narrative of righteous victimhood. It was within this environment of absolute confinement, stripped of his delusions and his autonomy, that his cardiovascular system finally succumbed to the immense physical stress of his situation, bringing his life to a sudden, unglamorous end before the state could formally hold him accountable. For the medical professionals at the Vancouver General Hospital Burn and Trauma Unit, treating the unique injuries inflicted by a mail bomb required a complex, multidisciplinary approach that highlighted the long-term physical cost of modern domestic terrorism. The impact of hundreds of iron nails traveling at supersonic speeds creates a chaotic pattern of tissue destruction that cannot be easily repaired by standard surgical techniques, forcing doctors to perform multiple successive operations to systematically remove the deeply embedded shrapnel while preventing widespread systemic infection. Every day, Roger Nepper had to endure the agonizing process of wound debridement and skin grafting, a grueling medical ordeal that tested the limits of his physical endurance and emotional fortitude while his wife Shirley watched from the bedside. Her own bandaged hands a testament to the blast's reach. The permanent loss of his fingers meant that the simplest tasks of daily life, buttoning a shirt, holding a cup of coffee, or turning a door handle, would now require a monumental effort of adaptation and retraining, transforming his peaceful retirement into a perpetual battle against physical limitation. This intimate, daily struggle for physical reclamation is the true, hidden reality of violent crime, a long and lonely journey that continues for decades after the police tape has been taken down and the public interest has shifted to other headlines. The absence of a judicial resolution in the Yukon mail bomb case also left a permanent stain of frustration on the legal history of the territory, serving as a prominent case study in the vulnerability of the Crown's prosecutorial process to the unpredictable reality of a suspect's mortality. Law students and legal analysts in Western Canada regularly review the procedural history of the Nepper case, examining how the sudden death of a sole defendant instantly paralyzes the machinery of justice and leaves the state unable to establish an official, historical record of guilt. Without a formal trial, the evidence collected by the forensic teams remains classified as investigative material rather than proven fact, creating a legal twilight zone where the truth is known to everyone but officially verified by no one. This structural limitation of the adversarial system is a bitter pill for victims to swallow, as it prioritizes the constitutional rights of the deceased suspect over the collective need for public vindication and closure. The case file remains frozen in time, a permanent monument to a legal process cut short, reminding the judicial community that for all its majesty and complexity, human law is ultimately subservient to the fragile, biological limits of the human body. As the years pass and the global conversation around security continues to focus on digital threats, cyber warfare, and international political radicalization, the tragedy of the Nepa brothers remains a stark reminder of the enduring danger posed by the most primitive human emotions. The weapon that shattered a home in Port Alice was built not from dark web blueprints or foreign financing, but from a toxic mixture of old age, financial ruin, and a brother's unyielding envy. Proves that the most destructive forces in society are often the ones that simmer quietly within the domestic circle. The story of the Yukon mail bomb case serves as a permanent, haunting parable for a world that often forgets to look after its most isolated and vulnerable members, a reminder that when a human being is left alone with their grievances for too long, the mind can become a dark and dangerous workshop capable of manufacturing absolute devastation. The quiet breeze that blows through the coastal trees of Vancouver Island and the cold wind that sweeps down the Yukon River continue to carry the echoes of this broken brotherhood, a lasting testament to the heavy price paid when hatred is allowed to replace love. And a family's history is written in fire, blood, and iron. The systemic shockwave that rippled through the regional infrastructure of British Columbia and the Yukon following the arrest of Leon Nepa forced an unprecedented security audit within the logistics networks that bind these remote communities together. For decades, the transport of consumer goods, personal correspondence, and industrial equipment between the subarctic North and the Pacific coast had relied on a fluid, unquestioned chain of custody that favored speed and accessibility over rigid, military-style surveillance. In the weeks succeeding the detonation, senior managers from Canada Post and structural security engineers from the federal government held emergency closed-door sessions to analyze how a 73-year-old man, operating out of a basic kitchen workshop, could exploit the structural blind spots of an entire nation's shipping artery. They discovered that the historical trust embedded in domestic shipping routes, where parcels originating from rural senior centers or remote wilderness outposts were rarely subjected to the same intensive X-ray screening as international cargo, had been systematically weaponized by a killer who thoroughly understood the operational rhythm of the state. This deep systemic vulnerability led to a quiet but fundamental transformation in how mail is handled in northern transit hubs. Implementing specialized chemical detection sweeps and advanced weight anomaly algorithms to ensure that the public infrastructure could never again be hijacked to deliver a payload of iron nails and fire to an innocent doorstep. This operational overhauling was accompanied by a profound and painful reckoning within the social service agencies of the Yukon, which found themselves scrutinized for their apparent inability to detect the severe psychological deterioration of a vulnerable senior citizen under their direct supervision. Leon Nepa had been living in a government-subsidized housing unit, a facility explicitly designed to provide a safety net for the elderly and to foster a sense of communal security that prevents the very type of radical isolation that fueled his crime. In the wake of his sudden death in custody, independent reviews of the territory's elder care frameworks revealed a fractured system where physical health was occasionally monitored, but the deep, internal rot of mental health decay, paranoia, and obsessive grievance was left to fester completely unaddressed. Social workers who had interacted with Leon in his cardboard-covered apartment realized too late that his absolute withdrawal from society was not merely the eccentricity of a grumpy old man, but the active, defensive positioning of a man who had declared a private war against his own family. This systemic failure triggered a comprehensive rewriting of elder welfare protocols across Western Canada, shifting the focus toward proactive psychological threat assessments and mandatory intervention strategies for seniors experiencing catastrophic life losses. A collective realization that the most effective way to prevent domestic terrorism is to intercept the loneliness and bitter despair that serves as its foundation. Meanwhile, the deep physical and emotional reclamation process undertaken by Roger Nepa and his wife Shirley Bowick inside their repaired Port Alice home became a quiet study in the slow, agonizing nature of survival in the aftermath of extreme trauma. The human body can adapt to the loss of bone and tissue, and surgeons can meticulously close the deep abdominal wounds caused by flying iron shrapnel, but no medical procedure can extract the persistent, haunting sense of vulnerability that remains embedded in a victim's psyche. Every ordinary sound within their coastal home, the sudden groan of the house settling in the wind, the loud slam of a car door on the street, or the sharp rattle of the kitchen pipes, possessed the terrifying power to instantly drag them back to the blinding white flash and suffocating black smoke of September 11th. Despite these immense psychological hurdles, the couple refused to abandon the community that had shielded them during the crisis, choosing instead to display a quiet, dignified resilience that neutralized the destructive legacy Leon had attempted to impose upon them. Their daily life became an ongoing, silent victory over malice, an endurance match where the simple act of sitting together on their porch, watching the fog roll off the Narutso's inlet, served as an unyielding testament to the power of human connection over the forces of absolute hatred. At the same time, the archival reality of the closed case file created a long-term frustration for true crime researchers, legal historians, and criminologists who sought to understand the definitive boundaries of the Nepper family tragedy. Because the Crown prosecution was forced to enter a formal stay of proceedings due to the suspect's death, the vast repository of evidence collected by the major crime investigators, including Leon's private journals, his financial ledgers, and the digital forensic data pulled from his electronic communications, remained locked behind a wall of permanent privacy protections. This administrative barrier prevented the public from ever seeing the full architectural blueprint of the crime, leaving the narrative permanently vulnerable to local rumors, half-truths, and the distorted myths that inevitably grow around unpunished atrocities. The legal system had successfully protected the public from a physical threat, but its procedural rigidity left a permanent void in the historical record, a reminder that human laws are designed to manage the living, and are entirely powerless to extract confessions, deliver justice, or provide absolute clarity once a perpetrator slips past the threshold of mortality. As the years pass and the events of 2018 recede into the deeper history of the Canadian West, the Yukon mail bomb case continues to stand as a dark and haunting monument to the volatile, unpredictable nature of human resentment. It is a story that bridges two radically different worlds, the stark, ice-rimmed mountains of the subarctic Yukon and the lush, rain-soaked forests of Vancouver Island, proving that no distance is great enough to dilute the potency of a sibling's envy when it has been allowed to ferment in the dark for 5 long years. The heavy iron nails that were meant to permanently silence Roger Nepper remain preserved in forensic storage lockers, a collection of cold metal fragments that tell a timeless story of familial bonds broken beyond repair by the corrosive effects of economic ruin and a refusal to forgive. The legacy of this broken brotherhood serves as an enduring, solemn warning to a modern society that often prioritizes technological connectivity over emotional literacy, reminding us that the most vital infrastructure we must fortify is not the post offices or the transit lines, but the deep, foundational capacity for empathy and understanding that keeps the human heart from collapsing into the absolute darkness of a calculated vengeance. The philosophical and existential weight of a crime that remains forever unadjudicated creates a lasting disruption in our collective understanding of morality, a structural paradox that continues to define the historical memory of the Yukon mail bomb case. In a world driven by a desire for narrative symmetry, we expect violent acts to culminate in a public theater of accountability, where the perpetrator is forced to listen to the precise human cost of their malice and the state delivers a calculated, objective measure of punishment. When a suspect like Leon Nepper cheats this process through a sudden and unglamorous biological failure inside a prison cell, he effectively freezes the narrative in its most chaotic and painful moment, leaving the living victims trapped in a permanent state of emotional suspended animation. This lack of a formal conclusion forces a deeper, more sobering meditation on the absolute limits of human institutions, demonstrating that for all our advancements in forensic analysis, tactical deployment, and legislative design, our machinery of justice is ultimately a fragile, earthbound construction that can be easily derailed by the simple, unpredictable stopping of a frail heart. The law can dismantle a workshop, intercept a suspect, and catalogue evidence with perfect mechanical efficiency, but it possesses no power to compel a confession from a corpse, leaving the ultimate truth of a broken brotherhood to exist solely within the quiet, unvetted memories of those who survived the blast. This unresolved structural vacuum is particularly painful for the surviving victims, who must find a way to rebuild their lives in the absence of the public validation that a guilty verdict provides, a daily labor of psychological survival that receives no assistance from the state. For Roger Nepper, the physical reality of his missing fingers and the deep, sensitive scars across his torso served as a constant, tangible text written by his brother's hatred, a domestic monument to a betrayal that could never be explained or atoned for. Every morning that he woke up in his restored home in Port Alice, he was forced to navigate a physical world that had been fundamentally altered by a parcel sent from thousands of kilometers away, engaging in the slow, agonizing process of adapting to permanent physical limitations while his mind wrestled with the unanswerable question of why a shared childhood had curdled into absolute murder. His wife, Shirley, lived with her own invisible injuries, a heightened state of neurological vigilance where the ordinary, comforting rhythms of rural life, the arrival of the morning post, the sudden slam of a neighbor's car door, or the heavy rumble of a delivery truck, became potential triggers for a rush of primal panic. Their survival was not a sudden, triumphant moment of recovery, but a quiet, grueling war of attrition against the legacy of Leon's malice, an endurance match won through the slow reclamation of their domestic sanctuary from the memory of fire and iron. The broader lesson embedded within this dark chapter of Canadian history speaks directly to the hidden dangers of extreme isolation in modern society, a condition that can transform the ordinary human mind into a dark, self-contained radicalization chamber. Leon Neper was not born a monster, nor was he connected to any international terrorist organization or radical political movement that provided him with a grand ideology of violence. His radicalization was entirely domestic. Nurtured in the absolute solitude of his subarctic apartment under the heavy pressure of long, dark northern winters. When his life was stripped of its stability by the 2013 fire in Tagish, his inability to process his own vulnerability caused him to look outward, projecting his financial ruin and personal failures onto his younger brother until that projection became a monolithic, unyielding reality. Without the daily friction of ordinary social interactions, without the stabilizing presence of friends or community groups to challenge his growing paranoia, his mind was free to cultivate a pristine, uncontaminated hatred that eventually viewed the construction of a bomb as a necessary act of righteous justice. This case serves as a chilling warning to a highly connected digital world that often confuses technological infrastructure with genuine human community, reminding us that when an individual is left entirely alone with their grievances for too long, the internal boundaries of empathy can completely dissolve, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus on destruction. As the years continue to pass, carrying the events of September 2018 deeper into the archives of the Pacific Northwest, the quiet town of Port Alice has slowly reclaimed its identity as a peaceful sanctuary, though the invisible scars of the bombing remain woven into the fabric of the community. The yellow police tape has long since decayed, the shattered glass has been replaced, and the local post office continues to process the daily mail with the same steady, unremarkable routine that has defined the village for generations. Yet, beneath this superficial restoration lies a permanent understanding that geography is no longer a shield against the complex, volatile currents of human emotion, and that the most devastating threats can often originate from the very people who share our names and our bloodlines. The heavy iron nails that were meant to permanently erase Roger Neper remain resting in dark forensic storage lockers, cold metal artifacts that tell a timeless story of a family bond that fractured so violently its shards flew across a continent. The legacy of the Yukon mail bomb case remains a silent, haunting parable of the human condition, a stark reminder that the structures we build to protect ourselves are only as strong as the human hearts that inhabit them. And that the ultimate defense against the darkness of calculated vengeance is not a locked door or a screened package, but the persistent, daily commitment to empathy, communication, and forgiveness.